I'm Jeff Nyquist. This is Friends and Enemies. I'm here with Alex Benesch, and we have discussed. We've gone through conspiracy theory. Now we're going to discuss how the systems of control, espionage, and tactics and strategy work. So, Alex, you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay. I thought I would make sort of a general comment before we start to frame everything. You see that we have these tactics that we see around us that are happening in the current political situation that virtually nobody notices. Certainly, the media do not notice it, and were present in recent history. And it is the tactic of using intelligence forces for influence operations to influence both sides in a political debate, to influence the right, to influence the left. And you had under Stalin, you had this idea of pressure from above, pressure from below, where you had this propaganda that moved the masses against the people against the middle class, and then you had your lieutenants within the bureaucracy to push against the lower part of the bureaucracy. Pressure from above, pressure from below to get total control. But also, he had pressure from the left and pressure from the right. In Weimar, Germany, which was very important for the Soviet Union, was the battlefield in Europe. Control of Germany. Germany is the most important country in Europe. And of course, you had the emerging far right in Weimar Germany under Hitler. You had the left, you had the communists and the social democrats. And so Stalin's idea was you could use the left and the right. You'd infiltrate both. You'd influence both. And I think we see that today in Germany and the United States and other countries. You have this left-right. You have both the possibility of convergence, which I think the objectivist quote-unquote philosopher Leonard Peikoff wrote a book about Weimar Germany, claiming that the Nazi Party was kind of a synthesis of the far right and the far left. And he makes a case for that, which has some merit. And so what you want, though, is you want sort of the reasonable middle to be gone, because and then you want to create economic conditions that drive people to the extremes. And in the defector literature, there's talk about Soviet strategists talking about causing an economic crisis in the West or exploiting one to drive people to the extremes, especially in the United States. And so therefore we see it's not an accident, it's not an illusion that we see infiltration of the right and the left today, and that this is an actual tactic. So maybe you can explain how the Soviet intelligence formed this idea and formed its networks, and how it regards the right, not just as an enemy, but as a target to infiltrate and manipulate. So go ahead.
Well, I mean, internally, communism was known to be very, not flexible when it came to the average population. So, if there was sort of a change of wind, or some things got more harsh, or some things softened up a bit, you were expected to follow in line. You could not challenge the current climate in real life socialism. But when it came to the foreign audiences, communist propaganda was quite flexible. When I was in university, we had to spend weeks analyzing socialist art. So they had this concept of art had to serve the regime at all times. So whether it's music, whether it's poetry, it's novels, film, they had some quite capable movie directors, those pesky Russians. And so every artist had to serve the regime. And with the Soviet, when the Soviets were planning with the Nazis, you saw kind of this flip in the propaganda. So for a time, there was this anti-German propaganda. So you had these movies like Alexander Nevsky, and you can find that on YouTube these days in a remastered version.
Eisenstein.
Yeah, all these classics, the big classics. So, and especially Alexander Nevsky. This is sort of a saint-like figure from hundreds of years ago. So he defended the Russian motherland from these white devils, these Germanic and Swedish, these
The
Germanic,
Teutonic Knights.
yeah, the Teutonic Knights, the Swedish order and the German Teutonic order. So it's almost it's really black and white. It's like people have compared this to the evil empire in Star Wars. So some of these more modern movie directors, they took some inspirations out of that old Soviet cinema because it was so black and white. It was so in your face. So if you watch that film, Alexander Nevsky, you can see why there's still this hatred of the West. White guys, be they German, be they British, be they American, it doesn't matter. So white guys are the devil on a certain level to the Russians. And
by the way, we should note that Alexander Nevsky is a movie. I think it came out in 1938, which was just before World War II broke out, which ended up being a big battle between the Soviet Union and Germany, even though they had that brief period of being aligned.
Yeah. So
in 1939 to 41.
Yeah. So this went flip flop a couple of times. So when the relationship with the Germans was not good, then you saw a specific type of propaganda. And when there was this alliance, the pact with the Nazis, then some of these propaganda movies, they were put in storage. They were not to be shown in the Soviet Union. But then later, of course, they were shown again. And this is also where this thing comes from, this obsession with even today's Russia comes from, with the so-called Nazis. They see Nazis everywhere. They still see Nazis everywhere in Germany. They see Nazis in Ukraine. They're always fighting, Nazi, Nazi, Nazi. And so this goes back to this this Alexander Nevsky type, mythology. So the Slavic Russians defending their homeland against these white devils. And now, of course, the historical National Socialists are gone, but you still have white people today. And so if you're a Brit, if you're an American, if you look kind of German-ish, then you're the devil to the Russians. You're a Nazi to them.
No, hold on, Alex. Most Americans think that Russians are white people. How do you... explain that to people who think Russians are white people?
It's the art of being paradoxical. It's the art of being being contradictory. So the Russians, they always want to work different groups, and they support different groups, but they also betray every one of these groups. This is just how the intelligence game is played, and the entire system of communism is based on intelligence, and it was created with through intelligence, right? This was not created by emotion. This was not just created by, rebellious Marxist-Leninist spirit. It was done by intelligence, and so they will tell the West, the Western conservatives, they will tell us they love us. They will emphasize things we seemingly have in common. They will go back in history and find these examples where Western white people and the Russians, where they actually managed to live alongside for a while without killing each other. So they will go to history and pick these specific examples that fit the current agenda. But of course, the moment they get what they want, they can flip the script because they have many different scripts, and then they can turn on you, so you're the Nazi to them. And you're the devil, you're the white devil. And so this is something you have to remember. It's this technique of supporting different groups, telling them different things, and subverting every one of these groups, internationally. So you're helping them, but you're also betraying them, all of them. And so kind of this is how this game is played. I mean, recently I did this article on Vladimir Putin when his father got cancer, because Putin spent time in Germany, and Putin's dream was always to become this great intelligence asset. He was watching as a kid, he was watching this television or this movie series, The Shield and the Sword, about Russian intelligence.
Well, there was 17 Moments in Spring,
Yeah,
which was a famous Russian TV series, I think from the early 70s.
yeah,
I watched it.
and this was the
A Soviet
inspiration. He
series,
wanted
yeah.
this was the inspiration. He wanted to be an intelligence asset. He wanted to go to Germany, well, Western Germany. He wanted to infiltrate us and then subdue us. Just conquer us through intelligence. That was his big dream. And nowadays they put up these statues of Felix Dzerzhinsky, and they glorify the old Cheka and all of it. And so he's obsessed with intelligence, just like Stalin was. And so this was when Putin's first wife was freaking out. She died in a car accident, if I remember correctly. And then
No, I think she die recently?
no, the first one, Ludmilla, the first one.
Ludmilla's still alive, right?
No, I think the first wife died in a car accident, or she had a car accident.
That was Ludmilla.
I think
was
this
his
is the one he's separated from. This is the one who.
I think he's only been married once.
No, but I think it's the obese one, the obese wife. She was always talking to this other woman who I think was an informant for West German intelligence, I think. And so at some point, Putin's father got cancer. And so because in St. Petersburg, because the medical facilities are not good, they didn't catch the cancer early, so it couldn't be treated early. So Putin's father died from cancer. And so some observers have noted that Putin was responsible at the time for St. Petersburg and moving the money and selling all these assets to move money to the city of London, which was a KGB program. And so he was somewhat responsible for a lack of funds in St. Petersburg and the bad medical facilities. So it's partly on his responsibility. But because of all the history and the Nazi occupation of Leningrad and Putin's parents almost dying back then, because of all this backstory and all this Alexander Nevsky type.
You mean their siege of Leningrad?
The siege of
Because
Leningrad.
they were never able to occupy it.
No, but they surrounded it.
Problem.
They surrounded it, and they made life horrible for everybody inside. Inside of the
starved more than 1 million people to death.
City,
there.
exactly. And so with this backstory and this whole Alexander Nevsky type mythology, so this could actually mean Putin thinks that the backstory, all the history is responsible for Putin's father getting cancer and the medical facilities being so bad, because of the Leningrad and because of the poverty and because of this and that. So Putin might actually blame Germans, us, for the death of his father, and of course the old Leningrad thing. So this is sort of
certainly the death of his brother, who died in the siege of Leningrad, his older brother. Putin was born after the war in 1953, I think, 52 or 53. But he had an older brother that died in the siege of Leningrad. So and he grew up, Leningrad, he grew up his parents had a slightly better apartment than most people. They didn't have to share the way other people did, but he grew up in a rat-infested, moldy, awful place.
Yeah, and if he went outside as a kid, he was getting beat up. That's why he started to learn martial arts, and he started dreaming of becoming this intelligence agent and defeat the Germans. This was his idea. Take Berlin and just have this great revenge. And so eventually he got his wish. He joined the KGB, and he was stationed in Soviet East Germany. So he didn't get the foreign posting. He didn't get Western Germany. He didn't get Bonn. He got
Dresden.
He got Dresden, which was not really a foreign posting because it was still Soviet occupied territory, but still he could run operations against Western Germany, and this was his task. And there's a flurry of politicians that became very important later on, even heads of state of the unified Germany. Lots of interesting politicians, and the question is, how early did they know Putin? How early did they meet? So this is the question with the current Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who visited communist Germany multiple times when he was a young guy, a young communist, and also he was treated like a head of state when he visited, even though he was a 25-year-old communist. So it's Olaf Scholz. When did he know Putin? And it's also the one of the older chancellors, Mr. Gerhard Schröder, the pipeline guy, the Gazprom
He's been
guy,
working for a Russian company ever since he was
exactly. And so
chancellor.
the funky question is, how early did Schröder know Putin, who was stationed with the KGB in East Germany? So this is kind of this obsession with intelligence and this obsession with defeating the enemy, the white guys, the Teutonic guys who invaded Russia back then in the Second World War, and who tried to take Leningrad. It's just like the Teutonic Knights back in the day with Alexander Nevsky, and so to defeat the Germans, you need to be flexible. You need to have a broad approach, and you need to be credible with these front groups and with these networks that you're using. So Putin needs to be credible with the left here, the communists, and for some strange reason he still is. And he also needs to be popular with the extreme right wing. And he is popular with the extreme right wing. They're really impressed by his self-marketing, because Putin's marketing, for the most part, is almost like he's a czar. And this reminds us, of course, of the old days of Stalin, when some of these communists were getting a bit nervous because Stalin was using nationalist elements. He was playing with nationalism and the Russian heritage and all that sort of stuff. So to defeat the enemy, you have to be flexible, and you have to be able to pretend to be something that you're not. This is what a field agent has to learn. This is what field agents do every day. Now, of course, they can't or they shouldn't become complete actors. Sometimes they have to be. As an agent, you're supposed to create a fake persona that's based on your real persona, because that way it's easier to play your role if it's not too far removed from your true self. And so,
but of course, as one of the biographies of Putin is calls him the man without a face, that Putin doesn't have a personality. That who in the heck is he anyway? This has been the question that people have asked, and of course, Putin presents himself as the guy who boo-hoos over the fall of the Soviet Union. He called it the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, the fall of the Soviet Union, which is a very odd thing for someone to say who's taking over the Russian Federation. So he has this reputation with the left as somebody who was a KGB officer who respects communism, but then on the right they say, oh, he criticizes Lenin. Of course, he won't bury Lenin. Lenin's still in his mausoleum there. So yeah, I mean, Putin sort of has his cake and eats it too. He's both on the right and he's on the left. He, on the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, he spoke before the World Conference of Youth and Students in Sochi, which is the largest communist youth organization in the world. And he said, I am with you. We are with you. We are behind you. We believe in you. You are the future. Who says that? And yet he'll go to Valdai Hills, and he'll talk about how the West is giving up its beautiful, Christian values and conservative values, so that he's got something out of the box for everyone.
Yeah, and it became this sort of mongrel hybrid ideology thing that he seems to put on. I mean, because if he tries to appear like a modern czar, he lives in this big palace, and there's this even bigger palace that supposedly belongs to him. This was all over the news with the photos and the drone videos. And some of these other guys, they have these big palaces and they have these airplanes. So they live like czars in a way. And Putin always tries to name drop his favorite czars, Peter the Great and one of the Catherines and all that. So he does that marketing. But if we look at the czarist era and the serfdom during the czarist era. So you had these aristocrats running around, and below the aristocracy was, let's say, 90% of the population. It's usually tended to be 90%. And these people, they had no freedom, and they had to work every day, and they couldn't change their situation. Now that sounds awfully close to modern communism, if you ask me. So there are similarities between old school serfdom and modern real life socialism, because even if you look at the definitions, I mean, there's a modern definition, I think, from the United Nations, where it says serfdom is defined as you have to work on a field or a certain place, you cannot change your situation, you do not own anything, and so on and so forth. And
in Stalin's farm collectivization, basically returned the Russian farmer to
serfdom. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so suddenly, under glorious communism, you had to work on a field that no longer belonged to an aristocrat, but on paper, this field belonged to everyone, the collective, but the party controlled it. So this is now your place of work, or it was a factory, and you had to perform the work. Your pay was dismal, and what you could actually buy was also very dismal. So it's a clear parallel between, let's say, the dark, the dark era of serfdom, and there's a similarity to modern real life communism. And so this is also, I think, a reason why Putin can market himself as left and right, because the Russian form of control, or let's say the Chinese form of control that they have today, even the Chinese can introduce nationalist elements into their propaganda. They can emphasize 5,000 years of Chinese culture and history, and they're better than everybody else, and you have to look Chinese and you have to be Chinese. And so, I mean, they can play different roles like intelligence people would do. And I have a chapter here that's from my new book, and in my new book deals with it deals with communism. It deals with older intelligence networks in the Enlightenment and communism. And so, because I think the entire history has not been reconstructed yet, and there's a chapter in here about Stalin. And so I give a rundown in my own commentary. I give my commentary to a study done by Edward Ellis Smith. So Smith attended the Strategic Intelligence School at the Pentagon, Counterintelligence School at Camp Holabird, began working at the American Embassy in Moscow, serving as deputy military and economic attaché, then became a CIA intelligence officer and served various missions throughout Moscow. So he's not a historian per se, he's an intelligence guy. And so when I read his book, I felt... And
his book, by the way, was published in 1967? Is that right?
Something around that. It's called The Young Stalin, The Early Years of an Elusive Revolutionary by Edward Ellis Smith. And it's... you feel in competent hands because you're not dealing with a historian who is just, briefly touching upon intelligence matters. He's an intelligence guy. And he looks at Stalin right up until the revolution, and then when he became important in the new government. So this is an intelligence analysis, and so what Edward Ellis Smith is concluding is the following. So with a fairly high probability, Stalin had been recruited by the old Tsarist intelligence
And of course, what is Smith's evidence for this alleged recruitment of Stalin? Is this a guess, educated guess, or does he have anything?
Well, he doesn't have the one magic file that says, we recruited him, he signed the thing and he got his first payment. Apparently, there is no magic file, or we will never actually see it, but he's giving you an analysis like he would analyze everybody else. So, the probability that Stalin was recruited, this probability is measured by Mr. Smith, just like he would do it with anybody else. Basic counterintelligence, or let's say advanced counterintelligence. I'll get to the details. I'll get to the details in a minute here.
Yeah.
I get to the details in a minute here. And so basically, he thinks there's a very high chance for recruitment, but this is what ultimately mattered. But significant parts of the old Tsarist intelligence, these people, this personnel from Tsarist intelligence, they flipped allegiance to communism. We don't know, there's some estimates how many intelligence guys flipped to communism. It's not exactly clear the exact personnel. It's not exactly clear what operations were inherited by the communists and what foreign networks, spy networks, were inherited by the communists. See, this is stuff that still needs to be reconstructed. So Smith basically thinks that Stalin initially was recruited like other communists were recruited because they got caught multiple times. But then the game got more interesting because these intelligence guys, these government Tsarist intelligence guys, they started flipping. They flipped to communism because they thought, for example, this was a great opportunity. You could change Russia as an empire, or these individual intelligence guys, they could make more money, or they could have a bigger career than under the Tsars. So this way, an informant like Stalin was upgraded to a higher grade asset, but these Tsarist intelligence guys were no longer working for the Tsars, they're working for communism, essentially. So this would have provided quite a bit of expertise. So very, very experienced people who have been, in earlier generations, people who had been trained by the Brits, by British intelligence. You had these experts helping Stalin along and doing other tasks, making communism successful in the revolution and then in the post-revolutionary phase. So this gets into the Civil War, where the communists unfortunately won. And then after the Russian Civil War, you saw the strange success of communist espionage, especially when it came to compromising Britain. We've talked about this before, the Cambridge Five, the atomic spies, Hollis from the MI5, Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was under suspicion. So because these older Tsarist intelligence officers, they knew stuff about the British, because the Tsars were basically the same family as the House of Denmark, or let's say the British throne. So there was a weird thing happening when people switched allegiance to communism, and I think in that phase, I think that's when Britain became compromised, and so this is sort of the kind of a dose of secret sauce of communism. One of the secrets to their success, why they could infest Britain, why communism could infest Britain, and also partially the United States, because the Brits had clandestine networks in America. So there are different views, of course, about Stalin, and I've read different biographies of Stalin, as you have. So it's always important to have all these different opinions. But when I read, let's say, the Harvard historian Robert C. Tucker, I don't feel quite as much as I don't really trust him that much, because he doesn't think like an intelligence analyst. He's more like a standard.
He's a Marxist.
He demands the perfect file. If we don't find the perfect recruitment file, then he was definitely not recruited, which doesn't make sense. I'm not really convinced of Tucker's handling of this. And when I read Edward Ellis Smith, at least I thought myself in more competent hands, because Smith is an intelligence guy. He thinks like an intelligence guy, and he treats Stalin like he would treat any other person that he's examining. So, Stalin came from a humble Georgian background, was an unsuccessful communist revolutionary after his education at a church school, and then he magically moved up the ranks. He was repeatedly caught and imprisoned by the police. Many of his comrades distrusted him. He had no military skills and no money. He wasn't present at important events, but somehow, magically, he remained surprisingly relevant in the communist movement. And after the revolution, found himself in a prime position to continually expand his power until he achieved totalitarian rule. Stalin had been arrested so often that it would have been extremely easy for the authorities to recruit him as an informant. And moreover, he regularly traveled thousands of kilometers through several checkpoints without clean papers as a wanted man. So according to legend, he was escaping through ice and snow over hundreds of kilometers while he was sick in very cold areas of Russia. So,
Stalin was typically sentenced to exile, and he spent some time in Siberia.
Correct.
In a very cold climate. There is this letter, the Ehrman letter, which supposedly alleges that Stalin was a secret police agent up until 1910, when he was elected to the Central Committee of the Bolsheviks. And then he stopped cooperating with the secret police, according to this Ehrman letter, which most historians regard as a forgery. But not all historians. But it's controversial. Does he mention that letter?
Yeah, he does mention the documents, the files, but he tries
it's the only document, alleged document of Stalin having worked for the Tsar's secret police.
But if we're looking at, let's say, if we're looking at the world today, and you're looking at a person, today who could be a communist agent, right? So you look at, you don't expect to get his recruitment file, from Russian intelligence. But you have to look at this guy, you have to trace his life, and you have to check if he was repeatedly imprisoned, if there's anything that would make it more likely that he was recruited at some point. So you would look at a whole person's life up to a certain point, and you would try to make an estimate. So this is what Smith did, because in most cases you don't get some guy's recruitment file. If you suspect this guy, you don't get maybe you get lucky, you get a defector, and the defector brings you documentation, or the defector gets you the puzzle pieces you need to conclusively prove that somebody is an enemy spy, and then you can put him under surveillance, and then you find him with at the dead drop or at a meeting, whatever. So this is just a traditional method, sound method, that Smith is using. And of course, Stalin's life up to the 1917 revolution was retroactively romanticized by the Soviet state and stylized as the heroic story of a true revolutionary. But it's a very complex, difficult story. So
let me interject my. I've read many Stalin biographies, and Kotkin is one of the better ones. And one of the interesting things about Kotkin is that Kotkin says none of the other Bolsheviks had this genius that Stalin had, that he was a political genius that could have made the Soviet regime work, that all of them would have would have caused the regime to collapse, because they were more doctrinaire Marxists, except for Bukharin, who Stalin, of course, said, "You really aren't a Marxist at all." Um, and of course, Stalin was a guy that, purged. He played this game when he was in power, where he would support the right Marxists against the left Marxists. Then he'd support the go against the right Marxists with the support of the left Marxists. So he'd have one hand washing the other until he had the system completely pliable and under his personal control. And he did something that even Mao wasn't able to do in China, which was to have complete and total administrative control of all elements of the state, including the secret police and the army. And of course, he did this by putting in the people that he trusted. And the problem that I have, and that maybe Kotkin has, with the theory that that Stalin was an agent of the secret police, is that Stalin wasn't in control of anything when Lenin took power. He was in the executive group of Bolshevik leaders, but he wasn't in control of anything. And so you have Felix Dzerzhinsky and his deputy Menzinsky, who were not even Russian, they were Polish, taking control of the Cheka, inheriting the Tsarist secret police organization when the Bolsheviks took over in the October Revolution, in the October coup, which by our calendar actually happened in November. And the problem is that if they had in those files evidence of someone at that level, Stalin, being an agent of the Tsarist secret police, it would have been his death, or it would have he would have been encouraged to flee. So I don't know how he could have survived having been an agent, because this is when other people close to Lenin were exposed as agents. So, I mean, your comment on that?
I think it depends on who was hypothetically running Stalin, because if the people responsible handling Stalin, if they had flipped allegiance to communism, this of course presents a completely different situation. I mean, of course, if Stalin had been a small-scale informant, I mean, that would have probably been forgivable up to a certain point, because you couldn't be a socialist, revolutionary, or activist for a long time without getting caught. And so, if you're a small-scale informant, you could tell your communist comrades, or some trusted comrades, that you're an informant, and you could try to feed useless information to the handlers, or even you could feed false information to the handlers, or you could just try to betray people inside the communist movement that you think are terrible or you don't like them. I mean, this has happened before, that people give up certain comrades to the authorities. They wanted to clean house or whatever. But if Stalin's theoretical, hypothetical handlers, if they had already flipped or were in the process of flipping allegiance to communism, that of course would change things, because then, Stalin would have been an asset, but he would still not be viewed as a complete traitor to the communist cause. And so, this is sort of the idea of Mr. Smith in his book, where he thinks about that intelligence professionals, possibly Stalin's direct handlers, that these professionals were continuing to work with Stalin, helping him along the way. And of course, many Tsarist intelligence people later worked for the communists later on, and gave their expert knowledge, giving that to the communists. And Stalin is said to have had a job at the Tbilisi Geophysical Observatory, where other revolutionaries were gathering. He wanted to set up an illegal printing press, and the Tiflis Okhrana, the intelligence agency, arrested virtually all major social democrats on the night of March 21st and 22nd, 1901, but Stalin remained at large. This happened several times. He was egging people on, but he kept out of trouble for the most part.
That's very interesting. Just to note for the people listening, the Social Democratic Party was the party that Lenin and the Bolsheviks were in at the time. So just to let people know, that's what that means.
So
that was the Revolutionary Party at the time, the Russian Social Democratic Party.
During a search of the observatory, no incriminating literature was found in his room. He was present at a strike in Tbilisi in 1901, in which 2,000 demonstrators fought with police and soldiers. Decades later, Soviet authors gave a distorted account, declaring Stalin the leader or organizer of this strike, but this is not true. The day was a failure for the left-wing demonstrators, but a success for the authorities. And Stalin's reputation among the leftists in Tbilisi had become quite poor, and he moved to the Georgian port city of Batumi, where the oil was shipped. That was produced in the important oil fields of Baku in Azerbaijan, with the participation of the Dutch aristocratic company Royal Dutch Shell, the Rothschild clan, and the Nobel family. He had a portable printing press in his luggage, and other socialists thought this was a terrible idea to walk around with this thing. The transport was, was a fairly obvious thing to do.
What? I've never heard of this. A portable printing press?
A small printing press for pamphlets.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't.
Where you can make simple like leaflets or small pamphlets. So he was lugging that thing around. I mean, it was small for a printing press, but it was, it was still. That would be
if it's.
It was so obvious. It was so obvious. Other socialists thought, this was a stupid idea to lug this thing around.
And just for those, Stalin at that time, his real name was Yosef Vissarionovich Chugashvili. Yeah, but his revolutionary name then was Koba, which was the name of a famous Georgian bandit hero, like a Georgian Robin Hood, I guess. And this was his name. So that even Lenin, hearing reports of him, would say, "What is Comrade Koba's real name?" He'd be asking when he'd hear about this guy. What is his real name?
So then he was behind a demonstration in which all 300 participants were arrested, while he himself somehow remained unmolested. The Georgian socialist leader Noe Jordania wrote afterwards that Stalin only had intrigue and ambition to offer, but no real leadership qualities, no writing skills. On April 5th, 1902, Stalin was arrested for the first time by the Okhrana, the Tsarist intelligence. If he had already been a spy, the arrest would have strengthened his badly damaged credibility in left-wing circles. If he wasn't a spy before, it would have been an opportunity to recruit him as a spy, but of course there were more opportunities later on. Without a proper trial, he was sentenced to a lenient prison sentence and exile, although he was able to use this entire time undisturbed to continue managing left-wing networks from prison. Again, he was managing left-wing networks from prison. Now, this of course, he wasn't the only one who was able to do that, but normally you would need some kind of tradecraft, more advanced techniques to, send your orders out and receive, information back in, but apparently he didn't have much.
One thing about when Stalin was in Siberia, there was a report in one of the biographies I read of the guy that had to share quarters with Stalin. And one of the things he said about Stalin was incredibly selfish. Stalin would never do chores or do the dishes.
Yeah,
he would never do those little things. He would always stubbornly, selfishly, almost authoritatively force everybody else to do his work for him. And of course, he was in exile with other social democrats who had been arrested. So there was a group of them.
Mm-hmm.
He reportedly had some odd friendships that were outside the socialist group. and he was not close to any of the regulars as a person. He was sort of in a way, he kept to himself. So that report of his being in exile is kind of an interesting.
Yeah, and that fits. It also fits with his early behavior in the religious school. I mean, people were describing him in virtually the exact same way. And there was also some, radical literature going around in the old, religious school. And if you were caught, then you got.
They found it in his locker, and he was kicked out. Basically.
And so you couldn't, nobody wanted to really trust anybody. And the famous, or shall I say, infamous Trotsky. Trotsky later wondered why the Okhrana, Tsarist intelligence, handled Stalin's case without the usual prosecutorial and court procedures, and why the files on all his arrests were not published. There are different and contradictory statements about the time when he fled Siberia and returned, as well as the circumstances. Despite suffering from tuberculosis, he marched, supposedly, through the freezing cold and was then looked after by people in a forest hut, and then traveled thousands of kilometers home as a wanted man without being picked up at the 29 police checkpoints on the rail network. And pretty much no other socialist remembered his trip, and no socialist helped him along the trip, supposedly. So, and then the question, why should he even return to Batumi and to Tbilisi? Why make that long trip and go to a place where the socialists suspected him, they didn't like him, and he was already known to the police? Why would he return there? His activities in 1904 and 1905 are nebulous. So there's stretches of his life where we don't know what he was doing. And this is something that intelligence professionals are, of course, noting. Like Ellis, if there is a stretch of somebody's life with almost zero information, that's, of course, of interest. And he was arrested a second time by the Okhrana, according to a top-secret memo from the police's special branch. Somehow he was able to escape again and take part in the Bolshevik conference abroad, where he met Lenin.
And that was that the conference in London?
Maybe it was an earlier one. Hang on a sec. No, there was an earlier one. He was able to take the train to Stockholm for the big conference, where several of the 112 participants were Okhrana agents. Lenin considered Okhrana agent Jacob Shitomirsky a friend and a great revolutionary. Stalin traveled an estimated 23,000 miles, round trip, without being stopped, even though there had been an arrest warrant for him since 1905. Stalin went to Baku in 1907, where the Azerbaijani oil industry was located. A year later, he was arrested again and ended up in exile. Almost the entire year of 1909, the entire year of his life in 1909, is also a mystery. We don't know what he was doing. He managed to escape again and traveled, supposedly, over 1,000 kilometers to St. Petersburg and then to Moscow without getting arrested. In 1911, the police are said to have stopped hunting him because the term of his exile sentence would have expired anyway. But there was another arrest and another exile in Vologda. Then the confirmed Okhrana spy Roman Malinovsky, Lenin's closest confidant, was regularly arrested by the police to bolster his reputation. He seemed to encourage Lenin to appoint Stalin, of all people, as a member of the inner party circle, the Central Committee.
Now that's a very interesting point. So he's got this is from Smith, right?
Yeah.
So Smith has, I just ordered Smith's book. I want to read it. So Smith has Malinovsky telling Lenin to promote Stalin.
Correct.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the story continues. Escape from exile in Vologda, travel to St. Petersburg, Then he works for the Central Committee, and he got the gig. He got that job. He got the gig because of a confirmed asset. An agent who was exposed at some point later. Then a certain Boris Nikolaevsky suspected Stalin, and Lenin then made another Okhrana agent named Miron Chernomazov editor-in-chief of the newspaper Pravda. After Stalin's short trip to Baku, the Okhrana arrested a number of his comrades. Then another arrest, another exile in Siberia, and another escape. Man, he was Houdini. So, yeah, then you had the sort of the split in the leftist, or the splits in the leftist movement. And the RSDLP split, and the Bolsheviks founded a new party, which was later called the Russian Communist Party. Stalin ended up in exile again, where he remained until the outbreak of the October Revolution in 1917. Almost every revolutionary who had anything to do with him hated him, or at least distrusted him. Nevertheless, Stalin took no visible leadership role in the crucial weeks and months of the revolution. Nevertheless, Lenin gave him a position in the leadership of the Bolsheviks.
Now you're talking about the February Revolution.
When the
Tsar advocated, which the Bolsheviks really didn't have anything to do with, since most of them were in jail or Lenin was abroad at the time. So, but yeah.
So then, in the book, The Young Stalin, in the book, The Young Stalin, you see the picture presented by Edward Ellis Smith, the picture that Stalin's potential secret was protected. It was protected, and it looks like Stalin diligently tried to destroy files and falsify his history. So in the communist era, when Stalin, piece by piece, Stalin became more powerful and then the dictator. He did try to change history. He tried to fuddle things about his own past. And
now here I might interject something about Stalin and how he elevated himself. This biography of Stalin I found pretty interesting. Among all of them, The Time of Stalin, Anton Antonov Ovsienko, and his father was a friend of Stalin's. His father played billiards with Stalin, and Stalin used to make the comment, the Russian people are a Tsarist people, which kind of disturbed his friend. And but Stalin's method was rather intriguing, and this he learned, that Stalin got to be friends with the people in the secret police and the people in the telephone exchange. That's while all the other ministers and Stalin, of course, became the minister for nationality. Stalin wasn't Russian, and so what job are we going to give him? He'll be in charge of all the non-Russians, right? All the non-Russian communists. He'll be liaison for that. And so, but what he did in his office was he had made sure with his buddies in the phone system to hook up his phone, so it was basically a party line, so he could listen in to all the other government ministers and Lenin. He could literally listen to them. So according to this biography, he basically spent all day in his office in his phone listening to the other government ministers. And when you read Stalin biographies, what you'll find is Stalin had this technique in meetings within the Bolshevik government, and his technique was that he would wait for everyone else to speak, and then he would speak last.
Yeah.
He would weigh in. And it was like he knew what everyone was going to say, but he didn't know how they would react to each other. And so he was weighing what he was going to say, and then he would sound prescient. He would have something really smart to say, and this impressed Lenin. He always was going to impress the top guy. And eventually, this is what got him to be general secretary of the Communist Party, which was the key position from which he could administratively control everything. because this was the control of who went into what jobs, and of course you have the government, but you have the party, and the
Yeah.
party decided who was going to go into what government jobs. So Stalin and of course, and there's speculation about this. Of course, Lenin had been shot just before. I think we talked about the Lockhart plot when Sidney Riley, the ace of spies, the British super agent, had plotted to take over the government. He had bribed the Latvian rifles to kill all the Bolsheviks at a conference. Lenin had been shot by Fanny Kaplan in the neck, which caused the Red Terror and the canceling of this Bolshevik conference so that the Bolsheviks weren't overthrown by British intelligence. And as a consequence, Lenin had this wound, which some believe led to a stroke,
Yeah.
in a series of strokes. But it may be that Lenin, and guess who was in charge of Lenin's health when he had his first stroke? It was Stalin. Stalin became this most trusted guy who was then guarding. He picked Lenin's doctors. He
Yeah.
oversaw Lenin's treatment. And very famously, when Lenin's wife was trying to interfere with Stalin's control of her husband, Krupskaya was Lenin's wife, she complained about him, and Stalin got on the phone with her and used the F word and a bunch of other words, called her a bitch, for example, and just cussed her out. And of course, she wrote, this is in Lenin's last testament. When Lenin was recovering from this stroke, she told him what Stalin had said. And of course, Lenin began conspiring with Trotsky to remove Stalin.
Yeah.
And of course, just a few days before that was going to take place, Lenin suffered another stroke. And that was it.
Magically, how that happened. Yeah. So, what ultimately mattered, to gain power was intelligence, skills, and the spotlight. I mean, the spotlight has been so much on Lenin, Stalin, and some others. Others that got purged, of course, in the 20s and the 30s and so on. Because I was studying older intelligence networks, aristocratic intelligence networks, and that got me thinking in terms of what happened with the communists. When certain people of a certain status and people with connections, people with the expertise, if they, in a certain number, if they flipped to communism, that of course is something of great importance, because if the communists inherited these experts, or there was a merger of some sort, where older intelligence networks then sort of merged with the communists. This was dangerous because these aristocratic type intelligence guys, they had networks abroad, they had family abroad, they had a way into Britain, they had a way into Germany, and there was also some British networks in the United States. So I think this is something that hasn't been properly looked at. So if we look at Lenin, for example, or look at his actual name, Vladimir Ulyanov. So when his brother Alexander had already been executed because of terrorism, so after the execution, Vladimir, let's say Lenin, continued to work on graduating from school with honors for outstanding achievements, and then began studying law at the University of Kazan. Now, his father was sort of a low-grade aristocrat because of his services to the Czars.
Yeah, his father was the school administrator for a large district along the Volga.
Yeah.
And in fact, since he was the boss of all of little Lenin's teachers, little Lenin used it to tyrannize his own teachers because he knew that his father was the boss of bosses of the schools.
Yeah.
The most famous story about Lenin tormenting an instructor, his father actually found out. It was a rare occasion in which his
Oops.
father found out what little Vladimir was doing. And his father, it was the one time, because he was the youngest of the children, and he was the darling, Vladimir was. And his father called him in and said how disappointed he was in him. And it was the one time the spoiled little boy, Vladimir Ilyich, was chastised, and he didn't do it again after that. But this goes to character, that there was something. The family, the Ulanov family, was a very loving family. It was a very close-knit family, and it was if you met them, you would think what wonderful people his parents were, his family was. But he was this dark child, and his older brother turned to revolutionary literature.
Terrorism.
And he turned as a teenager, started reading Marx. And there was something dark in this younger brother, Vladimir.
Yeah, and it's always the most dangerous if people like this, if they get the training, the mentorship by professionals. If they can have a teacher, if these people like Lenin, if they can have a teacher that that will give them what they need to be truly successful, this is when it gets really dangerous. So Lenin, let's call him Lenin, studies law at the University of Kazan. Then he takes part in a demonstration. He gets expelled from school. He's banished to his home, and at home he starts or continues to read radical literature. And because of his mother's influence, he was allowed to return to Kazan, where he promptly joined a radical group and continually sought new contacts. Now, of course, his brother was already his brother was already gone. His brother was already executed as a terrorist.
I should correct myself. I think he was the third oldest, but I think he was the youngest brother. I think the rest were girls.
Yeah, I haven't looked at the girls.
Yeah.
So,
but he was. There were 8. I think there were 8 of them. No, I think he did have a younger brother, but his older brother was the more influential one over the future course of his life. And by the way, he was Vladimir was very talented. He was extremely intelligent, like his brother, because obviously, if you're a teenager and you're reading Karl Marx, you're very intelligent. One of the things, he developed a method of studying where he and his brother, and he probably learned it from his brother, his method of studying would be that he would analyze whatever subject, and he would be able to dissect it and break it down and reconstruct it.
Yeah.
And you will see this later in his, here's The State and Revolution. This is his book. And you will see that he does this. And he has this talent for analysis. And he's got these political instincts, which made him a very good strategist. Although Stalin, after Lenin's death, was heard muttering under his breath when people were praising Lenin after he had died in 1924, he wasn't a real leader.
Oh, God. Oops. So then, despite his activities, Vladimir remained safe, graduated with honors in law from the University of St. Petersburg, allowing him to work in the field for years. Then he was able to expand his radical activities and even expand it into Europe without being caught by the Russian Secret Service or by the secret services in Berlin, Paris, and Geneva. So either he had a natural inclination for tradecraft and security, or maybe some comrades had already schooled him in protecting his activities, because it wasn't easy, just to be this radical and not get caught. So this is sort of his early skill set in tradecraft. So he had activities in Europe. When he returned to Russia, his His pockets and suitcases were full of forbidden literature, which he distributed in various cities. His first arrest, charge of sedition, and a sentence of 3 years of exile in Siberia under lenient conditions, took place in St. Petersburg. So for socialist circles back then, he was no more than one of many activists, but the exile gave him more status. He was able to continue networking there. Next, he traveled to Switzerland, then to Munich, of all places, and finally London. And didn't have any military experience. He returned to Russia, then went back to Finland, Switzerland, and Paris, and had all his contacts there. For a long time, he did not notice that his right-hand man, Roman Malinovsky, was a spy for the Russian Secret Service Okhrana. Perhaps a little research background check would have provided information in time that Malinovsky had been in prison for several robberies and a rape, and then enrolled in the military using a cousin's passport. And so as a soldier in the regiment, he became an informant for the Okhrana. Because the German government allowed 32 Russian citizens to travel through its territory in a train car, it wasn't really that much of a sealed train, including Lenin and his wife.
One thing I might point out is that people did come to Lenin and say, this guy's a spy. And Lenin just wouldn't believe it.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of the fate of communist revolutionaries at the time. You know, couldn't be sure.
It's a normal, people who get fooled by spies and by infiltrators, they don't like to admit it because they look very. I mean, you look at Trotsky. The guy that murdered Trotsky was dating his daughter, right?
In Mexico, right?
In Mexico, and the guy would disappear, and of course Trotsky was warned about the guy, and the guy was suspicious, but Trotsky wouldn't, refused to behave, to treat it, and the seriousness he did. He knew Stalin was trying to kill him. There was an attempt actually on Trotsky's villa where there was a big shootout at one point. But he let himself alone in a room with this guy when he, I forget, was it an ice pick in his neck or it was he just assaulted him. And then, of course, the guy, broke down. I'm sorry. They made me do it. They were holding his, I forget the guy's name. They were holding him hostage. And he went to prison, by the way, in Mexico and was released when Khrushchev was in charge of the Soviet Union, and he was actually given, even after Khrushchev had denounced Stalin, he was given an award in the Soviet Union.
Oh boy!
After getting out of prison in Mexico, the guy that assassinated Trotsky. An interesting sidelight, but yeah, people are warned, and you would think that Trotsky, who was the Commissar of Defense under Lenin, who knew how the secret police functioned, knew how military intelligence functioned, in fact, and was trained. He knew that he would be more guarded, but he wasn't.
Yeah, but to be clear, it wasn't just hard for the communist revolutionaries to trust each other. It was also hard for the Czars to trust their own intelligence services and their own intelligence agents. So this was a crazy time.
We live in a world where we have to trust the people we work with every day.
Yeah.
So we can't. Who can really live looking over their shoulder? And this is where someone who has this intrinsic paranoia, like a Stalin or a Putin, you think, how did they survive? They survived. Stalin survived because he was suspicious of everyone.
Yeah.
He literally, if there was a report on you that was bad, you were dead or you were in jail. He didn't mess with it.
Yeah. Of course. I mean, in the for many years, if you had foreign foreign contacts, if you had family in Germany or whatever, this made you suspicious. I mean, this was kind of the most brutal, thorough way of doing counterintelligence. You were just squashing anything that could have been used against the communist system.
Yeah, and the Germans. I mean, if you read and you probably know this from the history of the Third Reich. Uh, Reinhard Heydrich was all jubilant that he had planted this information that Marshal Tukhachevsky, the top Russian general, the hero of the Russian Civil War, had been secretly collaborating, had met with people in the West, was collaborating with the German generals and whatnot, so that when he comes back to the Soviet Union in 1937, then he's arrested. And so here the German intelligence, the SS foreign intelligence, was we got Stalin to basically execute his best general. Was there.
And there's always, I mean, at all points in this Russian communist revolution and then the Civil War, there are many rat's nests of spies and traitors and turncoats, and there's still, I think, very, very important stuff that has not been uncovered yet, that has not been properly reconstructed, and this of course ties into the European aristocracy, because the Czars were basically the same family as the kings of Denmark, and the same family as the British throne. The House of Hessen, House Schleswig-Holstein, and then of course we're in the north of Germany, Mecklenburg, Schleswig-Holstein, these places. So there are so many networks that people are not even aware of, and so the German Empire at the time, which was formerly under the control of the East German Prussian line of Hohenzollern, but of course the German Empire was not a monolithic entity really, because there were competing aristocratic lines represented there, and
we might interject that the Kaiser Wilhelm II was not greatly beloved by members of his family, particularly the British branch of the family.
No, they did.
Edward, his uncle Edward, who was the King of England after Queen Victoria died, did not like him. Mm-hmm. They didn't like each other.
So the House of Hohenzollern, at the time, World War I, right? So in World War I, Germany was at war with Britain, and so the Germans, or the Hohenzollerns, they try to finance the Bolsheviks in the hope of bringing, calm to the Eastern Front. So this was one of the reasons why the Hohenzollerns, why they funneled money to the communists. But of course, this depended on the marketing, the self-marketing of the communists, their sales pitch, pay us and we can get you a separate, peace on the Eastern Front. This was...
this was a theory, early in World War I, there was a number of people, some in the German foreign ministry, that thought that if they could support Lenin and the Social Democrat, the most radical social democrat, Russian social democrat, they could cause a revolution in Russia, like in 1905, because everybody remembered the last time Russia was in a big war, the Russo-Japanese War, it resulted in a revolution, this 1905 revolution, which the Tsar successfully put down. And so there was this talk early in the war of let's get Lenin into Russia, let's support a revolution, let's finance it. And it was too iffy, it was too crazy, nobody would get behind it. But as the war ground on, and then you had in early 1917, you had the February Revolution, where the Tsar was overthrown, where the Tsar had to abdicate, basically, and you had the Kerensky government come in, and Russia was still in the war. Kerensky supported the war. They were going to have elections. It was a provisional government. They were going to have a democracy, so that Russia was going to join with Britain, France, and America, the other allied powers, to be a democracy. And then the German government started saying, okay, maybe this Lenin idea is going to work. So Lenin was in Switzerland. He was in Zurich. So they sent that former Minsk Jewish businessman to go see him, and in Zurich, to try to recruit him. You'd mentioned him before. I'm not remembering his name. But this is recounted in Lenin in Zurich, the book by Solzhenitsyn, where he makes a novel in his red wheel series, this interaction, this recruitment of Lenin to go back and have a revolution for the German government. And there's a book called The Sealed Train, which I have here, where the Kaiser actually wrote a letter saying, after Lenin took power, saying that now Lenin is ours.
Mm.
We made him, because they financed him through the Bank of Siberia, through Denmark, through neutral Denmark. They sent money to support the Bolsheviks. And so all the Kaiser imagined that all he had to do was expose the fact that, well, Lenin was kind of my agent.
Mm.
I've been there. I made the revolution. And then the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, by the way, which many Russians might feel was a betrayal of Russia, because look at what he gave up. Lenin gave up Ukraine.
Yeah.
Ukraine became an independent country. When people say there was no independent Ukraine, in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918, Ukraine was a country, an independent country with its own government. And it was the Germans that forced that on Moscow. Well, St. Petersburg. Petrograd, I should say.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and so when when the revolution happened, of course, one of the big question was what's going to happen to the last Tsar and his immediate family. Now, most of the Romanovs, meaning the House of Schleswig-Holstein, Romanov-Gottorp, that's basically House of Hessen and Schleswig-Holstein. Most of the Romanovs, they just left Russia in the course of the revolution and the chaos. So they stepped foot on mostly British ships, and they went to Denmark, they went to France, they went to England. Some of them went to Italy because they also had family relations to the Kingdom of Italy. Most of the Romanovs just left. It was not just the Tsar and his wife and his kids, so there were more of them, and most of them just left. So it would have made sense, of course, for the communists to capture the Tsar and then trade him, right? Because this is what intelligence networks do. If they grab somebody of value, they trade him for someone or something of value. Okay, of course. So this can be done even outside of the public realm, or mostly it's done outside of the public realm when you make a trade. So this would have made sense for the communists. And also the Tsar probably had the last Tsar probably had the most information about Russia, because ultimately the secret intelligence services, they were reporting to him. They were reporting to the Tsar. So if he had all this intelligence about Russia, that made the Tsar even more valuable. So it would have made sense.
Well, remember, there was the period from March of 1918 to the October Revolution when the Kerensky government had the intelligence. And they were actually being told in real time that Germany was feeding the Bolshevik faction through the Bank of Siberia.
Yeah.
They actually knew the money was coming from Germany. They knew.
Yeah.
And if you read the histories closely, a lot of these things weren't known until long afterwards.
Yeah. And also the communists, they needed the money from the Tsars to stabilize the communist government and to have perform the civil war.
You mean the money from the Kaiser?
No, also the foreign assets from the Tsar. I mean, because he had the Tsar had bank accounts in England. There were he owns stock. He owns stock that was traded through England and Amsterdam and that sort of stuff. So I mean, it's not exactly it cannot be calculated exactly what the wealth of the Tsar exactly was.
And none of that wealth would have gotten back to Russia, because the stock markets were all closed and frozen, so you couldn't move
And
any assets during this First World War.
So sometimes you see in a book or maybe on the internet in an article, you see these numbers being tossed around like 250, 300 billion in today's money. That's what the Tsar had. Most of what the Tsar owned was nothing you could move. It was land, it was palaces, it was mining, that sort of stuff. And but there, of course, there was also precious metals. There was gold reserves. There was cash, and there was stock, and there was foreign bank accounts. So it was kind of a broad array of assets. And so the communists, they had, the communists could have simply. The communists could have held the Tsar and his kids, squeeze him for intelligence, get all of the possible intelligence out of him that you could. The communists could have traded him and his family and gotten something in return from Denmark and Britain, because he's the same family, and also
Well, let me push back on that for a second. They had to move the Tsar and his family to the interior of Russia, to, I think it was in Katerinburg, where they held them sort of in prisoners there.
Yeah,
and what happened is that in 1918, what was it, July or August, when the Russian Civil War broke out, Admiral Kolchak had formed this White Army in Siberia. You had Denikin in the south. And of course, what were they doing? They were coming out of Siberia, and of course, you had the Czech Legion. They were Czech POWs from the Austro-Hungarian Empire who had been prisoners, and they ended up fighting for the whites. And they were marching on where the Tsar was to capture him.
Yeah.
And the Bolsheviks were quickly, because they had mismanaged the government and they had surrendered, this civil war broke out. Because their economy had collapsed, because they had tried initially to do some communist things in the economy, that they were losing control. And since they were terrified that the White Army would free the Tsar, the order went out to execute the Tsar's family before they could be recaptured by the whites.
Sure, but it would have been smarter for the communists to move the Tsar and his family, and then to keep him in storage somewhere, and at least even if you do assassinate him and wipe him out, I mean, at least force him to sign a confession, confessing to all these imperialist crimes and whatnot. Maybe do an audio recording. Maybe even have a film camera and have photos to have material that the communists may be able to use later on to paint a certain to create a certain narrative, to stabilize the communist narrative, because we've seen all the show trials. We've seen all the show trials, and it was quite
the
quite
show
effective.
trials were really Stalin's thing. And what I would say is that, you look in the French Revolution and the trial of King Louis XVI, and then of course they went and tried and executed Marie Antoinette, the Queen, and their children, which is really crazy that you're not only killing, but you see what really was frightening for the revolutionaries, both in the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, is that if those people live and they become, just as in the War of the Roses in England, anyone who has that title, who could claim the throne, could be a rallying point for opposition. And so the first thought, and these are people, remember, Lenin and his followers were steeped in the history of revolution. They were steeped in the French Revolution, and they knew it inside and out. They knew that history. They'd read everything they could on that, because this is what they were trying to do. They were professional. Lenin's whole thing was to be a professional revolutionary. And if you're a professional revolutionary, you know the history of revolution. That's your job. And the one thing you got to know is you got to kill the king, so he doesn't come back.
But the
rub that out.
Yeah, but the communists basically said nothing. about what happened to the Tsar. I mean, if they
No, they
had,
wouldn't want to be. They wouldn't want to admit having the blood on their hands. They
yeah,
would want to
but
be a little.
you want
They
to,
threw
yeah,
the bodies down
turn
a
him.
well to cover up.
You want to, yeah, but do you want to kill the Tsar and let everybody know, or have that effect, or because then you make him a martyr? You know, this is kind of a weird thing where. You know, they took no photos, they didn't shoot any film, there was no confession that the Tsar had to write, no show trial, nothing. Not even in storage for later usage. So this was kind of a strange thing. And also, with the oil fields, the reconstruction of Russia, you know, after the Civil War especially, the reconstruction of Russia was dependent on, you know, oil. The oil industry, the Russians, they needed help from Britain, they needed help from other places. You know, it's
Standard Oil came in and helped them out.
Yeah,
there
so to be able to you know, to be able to make deals with foreign countries, I mean, it strikes me as odd, you know, the choice of killing the Tsar and his family, and not even taking any photos, nothing, no film, no confession, nothing. It's just, this is, I think this is, for me, this
a
is
semi-organized group of bandits, and you've
Yeah.
come into control of a state, and you have all these Soviet means councils all over the country, and the government isn't even fully organized. People don't realize how disorganized it was, and you have the cadets, and you have the social revolutionaries, these other parties, and you had and the economy's collapsing. And there's starvation and typhus.
Yeah, but
is broken out throughout the country.
so many of the Romanovs did escape. So which is it? You know, if the communists wanted to wipe them all out, why did so many Romanovs just leave? You know, there was enough
because
Romanovs.
they didn't. First of all, the February Revolution happened before the Bolsheviks took power.
Sure, but
And you had all those months before the Bolsheviks, and then when the Bolsheviks took power, a lot of people left immediately, including Kerensky.
Yeah, but why not?
Who
I mean,
ended up in the United States?
If so many Romanovs just left and were still available, you know, why kill the Tsar?
And you got to remember that the Russia was so disorganized at the time and falling apart at the seams. The idea that you had this absolute tight control by the Bolshevik Party, they basically only took control of the Bolshevik coup was in Petrograd. Later became Leningrad. It was the larger urban areas because of the Soviet councils of the workers in the large cities. They got control there first. So a lot of the country they didn't even control. And you know, when so many months later, the South and Siberia broke away, southern Russia and Siberia broke away and started the Civil War. You had, you know, geographically, the whites controlled more land area of the country than the Reds did, although the Reds controlled the big cities. They controlled the western areas, minus Finland and Poland and the Baltic states that had broken free, and Ukraine, which had become an independent country. So you realize that this was an attenuated Russia, much smaller, and so that's why it wasn't going to work out. And of course, it's a very complicated history with the Tsarist regime. And of course, if you have made the mistake of taking the Tsar to the interior, thinking that it's safer there, that the White Army, that you know, what he's really afraid of is the Western Allies or the Germans getting a hold of the Tsar, right? So you make sure that but then you don't even realize that deep in the interior of Russia, there's this rebellion brewing.
So ultimately, during communism, you know, they finally declared, well, they're dead, they got killed, and so then the communists presented these remains, these bones that had been found close to the last known location. Now, of course, when the story was reconstructed, it seemed very, you know, the events seemed very chaotic. So the family was brought to the basement. They were all shot, and the bodies were then partially burned, and then they were buried, then they were dug up again, they were buried somewhere else.
Now, this was in the 90s that they dug them up, and then they held a funeral for the Tsar, right?
Yeah, very, very, very chaotic history. And so, and we do have to trust the communists on that one, unfortunately, because the communists presented those remains. And so the DNA test...
Who identified that? Now, the remains were identified under Boris Yeltsin's regime?
Hang on this was... hang on a second. I don't have the year here for the first study on this. So the DNA tests were carried out by the Russian Dr. Pavel Ivanov and Dr. Peter Gill from the Forensic Science Service in the UK. Now, of course, the remains were presented by the Russians, basically by the Russians. If they contaminated the remains, then there's no way to get an original sample from those remains. So you do have to trust the Russians on that one, unfortunately. So if
they're so trustworthy, of course.
If remains are contaminated, then they're contaminated, and you cannot remove the contamination. If the Russians decided to cheat on that one, and that's what happened. So generously, Prince Philip Mountbatten, husband of Queen Elizabeth II of Great Britain, and a close relative of the Czars, of course, donated a blood sample for comparison. This was cross-checked by Dr. Erika Hagelberg from the University of Cambridge. So the DNA and the remains that had been in the care of the Russian state, during the communist era, they sat on it. And so the DNA was broken down after all these years, so you can only find these little bits of DNA and then compare it to the blood sample of, for example, Prince Philip of Great Britain. This is what they did. So, and you also use this method, the PCR method. So you find these little pieces, and then you copy them, you amplify them, so you can, find these pieces more easily.
And so they verified the remains were...
Well, here's the thing. Here's the thing. In 2004, scientists from the United States criticized the results of the British Forensic Science Service and expressed the suspicion that the bone remains had been accidentally or intentionally contaminated. And then, an old shirt of the Czars... An old shirt of the Tsar with traces of blood that he wore during an assassination attempt in Japan is said to have been found in a museum. And supposedly the Russians pulled DNA from that piece of fabric. And the Russian scientist, Mr. Rogaev, was thrilled. He had, a straight blood sample or a DNA sample from the original Tsar to make that comparison with the bones, the remains. So all individual bodies of the Tsar and his family were identified using the PCR method and compared with the blood stain on the shirt or cloth from the Tsar and compared with the blood sample of Prince Philip. Well, the Japanese scientist Tatsuo Nagai doubted the test results as early as 1997, and in 1999 compared hair samples from Georgy Romanov with the gene sequence that Dr. Peter Gill from the Forensic Science Service in Great Britain presented. There was no match. The researchers said that, or the criticized researchers responded that the hair sample was contaminated. Then there was an examination by Dr. Alec Knight at Stanford University, which was cross-checked by other scientists and published in the journal Annals of Human Biology. Mr. Knight criticized the way the PCR method was used. The DNA in the bones, the bones lay at a shallow depth underground for over 70 years in an area where it gets quite warm in the summer and then gets cold again. The DNA must have decayed to such an extent that it's difficult to find pieces longer than 250 base pairs. So if the Russians say a sequence of 1,200 or more base pairs was detected in all 9 corpses, this is likely due to a contamination. And Dr. Knight and his team also examined the DNA from a finger of Elizabeth, the sister of Tsar Nicholas's wife, Alexandra. And this goes on and on. Peter de Knief, head of the Forensic DNA Research Laboratory at Leiden University Medical Center in Holland, agreed that Gill's and Ivanov's original studies were not entirely convincing. This Russian guy, Ivanov, also refused to take a look at the blood-stained handkerchief or shirt he refused to give another sample away to other researchers from that old sample.
Now, this rings a bell to me because you remember that when the I think it was a UK team went to Moscow to examine Hitler's skull, that the Russians claimed they had recovered from the crater outside the Führer bunker where they supposedly found Eva Braun and Hitler's bodies having been cremated. You know, they poured gasoline, they poured petrol in there, and they lit them up. They claimed this was Hitler's skull, but they found out this is the skull of a 35-year-old woman. Yeah. It wasn't even a man's skull, this Hitler skull. So the Russians have done this phony baloney forensic nonsense before.
Well, yeah. So I mean, I was completely open about this. I mean, the last thing we need is another silly, Romanov legend or some sort, right? So I was just looking.
So why?
I was really.
Why?
I was looking at this thing. I was looking at this thing, and I looked at the who did the Russian analysis and the British analysis, and what worldwide, well-renowned professionals were criticizing that study. And so, if by modern standards of a criminal investigation, if the only real hard piece of evidence, if that's a DNA test, and the DNA test is not conclusive, then you do not have evidence of a body. If you don't have conclusive evidence of a body, you don't have conclusive evidence of a murder. So then you have to reevaluate all the stuff that was done back in the day when some of the white troops, when they found this place where the supposed murder happened, they took samples from bits of evidence from the basement, and they also questioned people who lived next to that compound. But this was not. And
this was a Cossack unit, wasn't it? That
I have the name here. I got the name in my notes here.
I think it was a Cossack unit that first got there, and that's one of the things. The Cossacks could ride very fast and go over a lot of terrain quickly, and that was part of the fear that even if they tried to move the Tsar's family, they could have intercepted the train.
Yeah, and so this investigation by the so-called whites, this was put in a book, and there was some support from relatives of the Tsar because it's a large family. So some of these people were interested in what happened, but this is the samples that were taken, the photos that were taken, and the descriptions and the witness testimony of neighbors. This is basically all we have, besides a DNA sample that is unreliable according to world-renowned international experts. So it's not an ideal situation, and as I said, from the communists' point of view, they had several options. I mean, if they actually had managed to secure the Tsar and his family, the communists would have had different, options. Trade him to the Brits and get something in return. And so I think this is going to remain a mystery forever. And in 2000, something makes me wonder that you think the Tsar and his family stayed alive and in captivity in the Soviet Union. To me, it's inconclusive. I think the Tsar would have been squeezed for information, for intelligence. There would have been at least attempts to trade him, and I think the communists would have tried to make him sign a phony confession, to make an audio recording confessing to his crimes and his sins, maybe force him to embrace communism. I mean, there were so many opportunities for the communists there. And it's unconclusive to this point. I mean, of course, it's an intriguing, scenario out of many different scenarios that maybe
it's
they were
interesting.
traded.
Also,
they were just traded with the Brits, and ended up in Denmark or something.
Robert Bruce Lockhart, was it the son of the Lockhart plot? When the BBC did a series in the 80s called Riley, Ace of Spies, which was about the career of Sidney Riley, who was of Ukrainian Jewish origin. And I think we've mentioned him before. He was the model for James Bond that Ian Fleming later said that Riley was one of the people he had in mind when he thought of James Bond. And Riley had been went to Russia. And of course, we talked about the Lockhart plot. But one of the interesting things is that Riley was someone who suspected that there was something called the Trust, which supposedly a czarist organization was taking over Russia after during the Russian Civil War, and that the agents of the Trust made contact with Western intelligence, claiming we've infiltrated the secret police, we've infiltrated the Bolshevik Party. We're taking it over. Russia's moving back to monarchy. The Bolsheviks have given up on their communist ideals. Even Lenin says communism doesn't work. He's got the NEP. And they basically, and of course this woman who's Natalie Grant, under her wrote a book on this about where the syndicate or the trust is discussed in the book, and she was really at ground level. She worked in the State Department. She later trained. She was a Russian national who was one of the first people is working for the U.S. diplomatic staff. I believe it was in Riga. She was one of the first people to discover this trust and to suspect that Operation Trust was a scam. And of course it was, but Riley suspected it was a scam when all the other intelligence people said, look, this is legitimate. The Bolsheviks are really overthrown. Riley went into the Soviet Union in 1925. And, the legend was that he went in there to expose the trust. And in Riley, Ace of Spies, they show him trying to tell the trust to assassinate Stalin, prove that they're real by assassinating Stalin. And, of course, then being arrested. But we don't know that much. But what Robert Bruce Lockhart wrote a second book. He wrote a book to go along with the TV series. And then he wrote a second book about all this information he and his family had come into, showing that, and this goes to your theory about the Tsar and his family, that Riley had not been captured and executed by the Bolsheviks in 1925, as the series famously shows and the books show, but that Riley was kept in prison, changed sides, and became a kind of brain for the Soviet secret police. Yeah. That they saw him as being too valuable, being this Napoleon of espionage. And he was a guy who collected Napoleon memorabilia, Napoleon's personal possessions. He used to collect them. That they kept him, and that Lockhart had got a hold of these fascinating stories from people who claimed that during World War II they had met Riley in Moscow during the war, that he was working with Soviet intelligence. Yeah. So here it is, a guy, and it's a mystery. It's like, no, officially he's dead, he's gone. Yeah. We don't know what happened to Sidney Riley. So it's an interesting idea you have because of course the one interpretation of Operation Trust was false, a honeypot type operation where you would create a false, a false group and then use this as a trap, and people would walk into this trap. If enough older intelligence guys, if they had
if the older intelligence guys, if they had flipped to communism or merged with communism, that of course would have been a perfect starting point for something like Operation Trust, because you would have enough assets who are really, really credible to lure people into a trap. Because it's one thing if you're a diehard communist, pure communist, pretending to be against the communists, and you may have some assets who work for you and do that charade. But if you have this merger of communists and older intelligence guys, this would make for a perfect level Operation Trust, because you do have credible looking people. And it's not just inside of Russia, because as more and more of these so-called whites were leaving or moving to Europe, hoping to then get back to Russia, these white circles in Europe were also spied upon, and successfully. They were successfully infiltrated. And I think these whites had no chance, because the infiltration was also done through aristocratic individuals. Because if you have a person in front of you who seems so credible, who seems such like a traditional person from the Russian Empire, the Tsarist Empire, you would trust that person, because you couldn't know if he had flipped at some point.
Well, the important thing about Riley is he was friends of Savinkov, who was a very important Russian revolutionary who he was a white general who ended up believing in the trust, and on the basis of that went back into the Soviet Union and disappeared, and of course died, I think falling out a window. I forget how he died, but he died. He was made a prisoner, basically. So and there was another white general, maybe two others, that they lured back to Russia.
Yeah.
And of course, Riley was one that had been lured back, maybe trapped. But you don't know if any of those people were actually on both sides, double agents. Their luring back would have been really just returning home.
Yeah, and so maybe
right?
maybe the last Tsar and his family, maybe the last Tsar and his family, they were put into a certain place, stashed there, and maybe this was one of the requirements done by these.
If you're controlling the Tsarist movement by infiltrating it,
yeah,
controlling the Tsar would be the ultimate way to control the Tsarist movement, because then you could, at some point, if you get the control you want, let's say the Soviet regime was going to lose the Civil War or was really in trouble, they could put the Tsar back into power.
Correct. Yeah.
Say that he's been in charge all along, if you could control him by holding his immediate family hostage.
Yeah, and then and then of course after the revolution, you saw this weird situation with the British, the mighty British, the British Empire being so compromised and being so infiltrated. The Cambridge Five, guys like Kim Philby, the atomic spies, people like MI5 director Hollis, and Lord Louis Mountbatten. We've covered him before, and I've put out a video on Lord Louis Mountbatten where the FBI didn't trust him. People in Britain didn't trust him from the intelligence agencies. The French didn't trust him because Lord Louis Mountbatten, he had communist contacts. He was known to be a pedophile. He was known to be a homosexual and rumored to be a pedophile. This was even in the FBI file on him. And so there was treason all the time. There was treason on the British side, and in the Americans, they had then to deal with the consequences. And so, and
don't forget Harold Wilson, Prime Minister Harold Wilson, leader of the Labour Party, who was thought to have fallen under suspicion, and the Spycatcher scandal brought out that he was very possibly a Soviet agent.
So that
So
yeah,
you
so that
have all the way up to prime minister and
yeah,
heads of services
and
and
people yeah, and
yeah.
people were people from the British military. They were they started to hate Louis Mountbatten and said he was so vain and he has had such an infatuation with Russia and almost a loyalty to Russia and he was obsessed with Russia. That's what people said about him. And we mentioned this. He was Mountbatten was in charge of getting the secret papers out of Germany, occupied Germany. You know, the secret correspondence between the the aristocratic relatives in Germany, because there was a lot of espionage going on against the Nazis, of course. And so Louis Mountbatten was handling the secret communications channels to Germany, and he was supposed to get all these documents out of Germany after the war, so the documents wouldn't fall into the hands of the occupying forces. And whom did Mountbatten send? Who did he send to Germany? It was one of the Cambridge Five. I think it was Blunt. I think it was Anthony Blunt. It was one of the Cambridge Five guys that he sent. And so then people said, well, like in the book War of the Windsors, wasn't that, the biggest compromat ever? Couldn't the Russians then blackmail Mountbatten and his entire family? And this was just one of many things that were mentioned. But of course, these books, they don't go into the deeper levels of the intelligence history. And so it seems to me as like it was probably more than just communists infiltrating the aristocracy and then being very successful with it. Unfortunately, the communist espionage. There was it may have been more than that. Some sort of a crazy merger that happened during the pre-revolutionary phase and revolutionary phase in Russia, where important people in Russia, they switched sides to the communists, and they had sort of this concept of using talented people and having this new type of system in Russia. And so maybe this would also explain this strange appeasement which the Soviet Union got for quite a long time. The business deals.
Let me give you some pushback on
the
that.
Business deals and everything.
Because in practical politics, you had World War I, and the people were just plain fed up with war and fighting. And so the Russian Civil War, which went on beyond the end of World War I, was heating up in 1918 as World War I was winding down, and throughout 1919. All the way into 1920, it's like, so you're going to have British, Japanese, American, and French troops in Russia beyond the end of World War I. They were very reluctant to engage in actual fighting. So the British were up in Murmansk and Archangel. The French were down in Ukraine. The Americans and Japanese were in Siberia. It just wasn't politically feasible to intervene in any meaningful way to help the whites. And of course, whereas the Civil War in Finland went with the whites, won that one, and Finland became an independent country thanks to General Mannerheim, who was a Tsarist military officer, but an anti-communist. And you had in Poland, you had Pilsudski and the Polish generals, and Poland won the Soviet-Polish War. But Poland had stupidly agreed to a truce or a ceasefire with Lenin right at the moment the White Army was coming up on Moscow from the other side, from behind, from the south. And this was a terrible mistake, because then the Bolsheviks were able to swing around, take their forces off of Poland, and hit the White Army. And so history was it was changed, but the whites lost. That was their only chance right at the beginning of the Civil War, when Poland was active. That was their only chance, when the Polish front and the White Army could have linked up That was the only chance they had to knock out the Bolshevik regime. And from that point on, everybody knew the military reality was the whites were outnumbered 7-10 to 1 or worse. And Poland was just lucky to survive, because the Bolsheviks turned around and went after Poland and almost defeated it. So everybody was just eager for the war to end. Eager for that because it was, again, a wild ride in World War I and a wilder ride in the Russian Civil War. And so the French withdrew, the British withdrew, the Japanese and Americans withdrew, and the White Army lost.
Yeah, and also when, or let's say if the communists had a certain number of aristocratic people working for them or with them, aristocratic networks working for them, this was pure gold from a spy standpoint, from an espionage standpoint, especially against Germany. It wasn't just the infiltration problem with Britain and all that stuff, but in terms of Germany, this was really, really. This was the gift that kept on giving, apparently. So, for example, this example here. In the year 2000, the two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative author Lou Kilzer exposed Martin Bormann as a spy for the Soviet Union in his book Hitler's Traitor, who had revealed all relevant military plans of Hitler and the general staff down to the last detail. So, so I read the book and I tried to go back even further into Martin Bormann's past. I was specifically looking for aristocratic connections. Now, of course, Lou Kilzer himself was no stranger to the topic of aristocratic intelligence because of his book, Churchill's Deception. Now, in Churchill's Deception, it does focus mainly on the deception maneuver, but it does contain many individual instances of aristocratic espionage against the Nazis, and some really significant assets and some significant, smaller operations. So I was reading Hitler's Traitor, and I was specifically looking for aristocratic connections that Martin Bormann might have had. So Bormann was just 14 years old. Bormann was just 14 years old when the First World War broke out. He ran away from home, wanted to enlist in the German military, but was rejected because he was too young. In 1918, last year of the war, he was able to join the 55th Field Artillery Regiment, but did not take part in any fighting in the final months of the war. From then on, he earned his living as a farmer's assistant on the estate of his former officer, commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hermann von Treuenfels in Mecklenburg, where he quickly rose to become manager of the estate. The Mecklenburg royal house or aristocratic house plays an essential role in these elite families, so especially in connections to the British throne. So, for example, sublines like Mecklenburg, Mecklenburg-Strelitz, and then, of course, right next to Mecklenburg is Schleswig-Holstein. So these are the important areas, and the aristocratic families are named after these places. So, and of course, the Mecklenburg aristocracy, they also had an important tie to Denmark, which is of course right next to it, and the House of Denmark was the same as basically the Tsarist, the family of the Tsar. So just to give you an idea, this is basically
all the Danish house, Queen Victoria's family.
So this is
the to-be Greek monarchy. And the German monarchy and the Russian, and they're all interrelated by marriage.
And you can almost swim from one of these countries to the other. There was some guy who fled communist Eastern Germany during the Cold War. He actually swam, I think, from the coast to Denmark. So he had collected some amphetamine pills, and he was a good swimmer. So he swam like a whole day and a whole night and ended up in Denmark. So this is how close they are to each other. You know, Denmark and Schleswig-Holstein, Mecklenburg, Britain. You know, this is the area we're talking about. And so, so for example, just to give you an idea, a certain Adolf Friedrich IV, Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, he lived from 1738 to 1794. He was the son of the princess of Sachsen-Hildburghausen. In 1761, he married his younger sister. He married his younger sister, Sophie Charlotte, to George III, King of Great Britain. So he shipped off his sister to King George III of Great Britain.
And that was a happy marriage, by the way. They both loved each other. They did. That was a true love story there.
Yeah, they took care of that. They made sure that they liked each other most of the time.
Yeah.
Duke.
Yeah.
And then here you have Duke Adolf Friedrich V of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. He was the child of Princess Augusta Caroline of Great Britain, Ireland, and Hanover, and so on and so forth. So these are the families we're talking about. And so in Mecklenburg, in Mecklenburg, you had the noble family of Treuenfels. And with that Treuenfels and that family called Treuenfels, the Treuenfels family, they found Martin Bormann and gave Bormann a career. And so this Treuenfels family goes back to 1689, which is a long time. But of course, the top families, they go back at least 1,200 years. So there's that. And in addition to his work as an estate manager, Bormann also worked on a voluntary basis as a section leader in the traditional association of the former Rossbach Freikorps. So these were these right-wingers who then morphed into National Socialists, and they were going around doing limited operations, and they were armed, of course. So the Freikorps groups. And some men from this particular Freikorps later had great careers in National Socialism as leaders of the SS and SA. And so then there's the next step in his career. Yeah, and of course there was some rumblings in that Freikorps group, and of course if you were somebody who showed loyalty to the group, that meant you had a bigger career later in the Nazi system.
This theory that you have about aristocrats, some aristocrats wanting Bolshevism. This is an opportunistic. How do you conceive these, and which aristocrats specifically? Because there are opportunists and people that will support a cause, Nazism,
sure,
communism, liberalism, whatever, based on personal beliefs. Beliefs and opportunity.
I think one of the driving factors was this idea that you could have a new version of serfdom. The aristocratic idea of communism would be, another type of serfdom. And of
but
course,
anybody observing the Bolshevik regime would see that aristocrats had no place in it.
No, not overtly, but there was at times in the past the idea, floated around in Russia to have to maintain the Czars, to maintain part of the aristocracy, and then have socialism below it. So you had these different ideas tossed around, and
that really wasn't part of Bolshevik. The understanding that anyone had of the Bolshevik government. I mean, you had Felix Dzerzhinsky and Menzinsky were Polish aristocrats, but they were fanatical communists who were not, by any means, did not identify as aristocrats anymore.
No, but if if the communists inherited some important older intelligence circles in Russia, that's of course a link to other very important aristocratic families, because
And the Bolshevik regime did basically weed out most of the old. They found ways to retire and get rid of those old Okrana people once they got trained by them. I don't think any of them, and none of them became heads of the service. I don't think any older Ukraina general ever emerged in any position of authority within the Cheka, GPU, OGPU, NKVD, KGB. I don't think I've ever heard of that. Have you?
Well, not the leadership, no, but there's so many bureaucrats, and also in the intelligence services and the handbooks, all of that was inherited by communism, and it's at some point when World War II was happening, or when let's say for example when Bormann was recruited. I mean, it wasn't clear at this point how Bormann would be used by this Treuenfels family, for example. But at some point during the Nazi era, certain aristocratic families in Germany, these aristocrats, they wanted to end the Hitler regime. They played along with it. I mean, they pretended to be friendly with the Nazis, but they were scheming behind, Hitler's back, and they had their channels to Britain and so on and so forth. And so at some point it was, for example, possible to use some of these assets that were recruited early on, to use these assets in order to get military information out of Germany and get this information, for example, to the Russians. So this was a very simple type of strategy and simple operation, because many generals wanted to kill Hitler even early on, but they were afraid of a civil war. And most of the generals were aristocrats themselves, and some of these families had ties to Britain, and they had ties into different directions.
And of course, once Hitler started to be successful in his diplomatic policies, they were more, especially after Munich.
Yeah, and of course,
and the giving up of Czechoslovakia, they thought, well, he's winning, it's good for us.
Yeah, well, but of course, when Nazi Germany was then. When Nazi Germany was at war with Britain, and even before that, of course, it was obvious that the British would use their aristocratic secret channels to Germany to try to conduct espionage against the Nazis and to weaken the Nazis. And if you had somebody placed close to Hitler or in any interesting position, you could then grab information and ship this information off, for example, to the Russians.
You may remember this incident. It's recounted in Schellenberg's memoirs that that early in the war in 1940, the SS intelligence, SS counterintelligence, in fact, had concocted this idea of creating a fake German military resistance to Hitler that they would control. And they had a guy impersonate a German colonel, I think it was the rank they gave him, that he was going to go and meet with these two British agents in Holland. And Schellenberg, at the time, who was not yet the head of AMT6, went over to Holland with some other agents and met with these two British intelligence agents, and then to arrange a meeting with this concocted aristocrat officer who was just playing a role of a fake German anti-Hitler officer that wanted to overthrow Hitler, to negotiate with the British. And of course, what happened in the middle of it was there was a mishap in Holland that turned into a shootout, and Schellenberg ended up having to capture these two British intelligence officers who spent the war in captivity. And of course, this soured the British on the idea of there being a legitimate, they knew that they had had contacts, and of course, this is part of what Admiral Canaris was involved in, that they had been fed a fake idea of a fake military opposition to Hitler in 1940. And that, obviously, that is going to sour you, right? On the idea that they could just be feeding you another fake.
Well, I mean,
What do you think?
the Brits were better in intelligence than the Germans. Overall,
I'm not so sure.
Overall,
Given
I
what
think
the British, all the fumbles of the British.
I think overall and especially some of these old families. I mean, they've done this for 1,200 years. I mean, they like the Welfs. You know, when they had their first British king, George I. I mean, this family had been around for 1,200 years. And they started small and they gained more territory. Then they went into Denmark and then they infiltrated Scotland. And they married a Danish princess to King James. And then they got the Glorious Revolution with help from with help from the Netherlands, you know, from the Orange Nassau family. So they had the Glorious Revolution, and then a bit later you had King George I. So these people are professionals. I consider them specific aristocratic families. I consider them to be absolute professionals in terms of intelligence. And the problem that Germany had was that on German territory, you had these very, very old families, and they did their own thing. They were their own thing. And so when the Nazis created their empire, it was already infiltrated. So it was almost impossible to keep a secret in Nazi Germany. And so here, for example, we have this example of Martin Bormann. I mean, we never got any inclination that Bormann was a believer in communism. He was an ultra right-wing guy from his teenage years on. He was ultra right-wing. He was in the Freikorps groups, and Bormann also was the protege of the very old Treuenfels family. And then this Treuenfels guy was also a member of the German National Freedom Party. This was one of the many right-wing parties before the NSDAP became the sole party. And one of the leading politicians of that political party was Ernst Graf or Count zu Reventlow, who was from a very old aristocratic line. So again, Mecklenburg, and one of his ancestors called Detlev Reventlow was appointed Danish chancellor by Christian IV of Denmark in 1632. So that means you're important. If you become Chancellor of Denmark, if you get appointed to that job by the Danish king, then you're important. And so this was
in 1632.
In 1632, and this was, of course, this is like the 1500s and 1600s. This is when, especially these aristocratic networks from Denmark, that's when they infiltrated Scotland, and then married a Danish princess to King James and tried to infiltrate Britain as much as they could in preparation of the later Glorious Revolution, and then, of course, King George I. So these people were professionals. And
but you see, the thing is everything changes over time, and it changes its character and its direction. We shouldn't ever judge anything, to paraphrase Nietzsche, by what it is now, but what it is becoming. So the real question is, what are all these people becoming? And what is Europe becoming? Europe isn't the same thing today as it was 100 years ago or 200 years ago. It's a very different kind of thing. And we have a different set of beliefs coming in. And we had the French Revolution changed Europe forever. We had the defeat of Napoleon and the concert of Europe, and we had the restoration of these monarchies, well, the entrenchment of them for another 100 years until World War I. But then the revolutionary impetus continued again. And I turn to deeper. See, people are motivated by philosophies, And that you can't say that all these people believe the same things or have the same philosophy or ideology that they had 200, 300, or 400 years ago, 1632. There's been a transformation of the human material, of the human outlook, that's gradually pervaded, and that the Bolshevik Revolution is essentially a part of this transformation. Um, and so we have to realize that the cause there's causal elements, there's intellectual and philosophic elements of change.
Yeah, but you have to
Mainly the
remember
change in
Denmark, the family of the aristocratic families or the ruling family of Denmark, with their relatives from the House of Hessen and Schleswig-Holstein. These families, they conquered the Russian throne. When what was he called? Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible was the first real czar, but over time, different families fought for control, and from czar to czar, it became more and more the House of Hessen, the House of Schleswig-Holstein, Denmark. So these people were not playing around. They were not stupid. They were not buffoons. And then, of course, in Britain, they took over Britain, and they made, especially starting with King George I, they made Britain into an absolute powerhouse. When King George happened, Britain was in some ways behind France, but then over the next 100 years, especially with British Freemasonry and the scientific Royal Society, Britain just took off. They became the most successful thing. And the success was in large parts due to superior intelligence networks. And the French lost power. The French monarchy lost power. Of course, the Austrians lost power. The Prussian Hohenzollerns, they lost power. But there's also this gigantic cluster that almost nobody's even aware of, these specific types of families. And they've grown their numbers to a very large degree. And I think in terms of intelligence, they were better than the French, and they were better than the Austrians, and they were better than these others.
I don't think that you can, I think it's maybe a mistake to suggest that the Romanov family was somehow in league and completely amenable to what the monarchy in Britain wanted, as if the government of Britain was not a mixed system where Parliament had a lot to say about what they did, was that there was this combination, because after all, France and Great Britain fought the Crimean War against the Russian Empire in the middle of the 19th century, but you had characters like Nicholas I, who became Tsar after Alexander I's death. Alexander I, who was the Tsar during Napoleon's time, was a strange character who was all over the map. He was considered a destabilizing element. Both Metternich and Castlereagh tried to contain him because he would have these strange ideas. And of course, when after the fall of Napoleon, Tsar Alexander went to London to meet politicians there, the British public, the British aristocracy, the British monarchy, they were disgusted by him and his arrogant behavior. That he had run roughshod over so many people. Russia made itself unwelcome, even though Russia had been essential in the defeat of Napoleon. And of course, Tsar Nicholas was kind of Tsar Alexander was kind of he was educated with these Enlightenment ideas. And then his brother, Nicholas I, was a famous reactionary who was going to rule with an iron fist, very different, two different personalities, who kind of made the character of the Tsarist regime after the Napoleonic Wars, after Alexander. I think Alexander died in 1820, something like that. And so I think that it's to characterize them as united or involved in kind of a concert. It was an ideal of certain politicians in Central Europe, German politicians in particular, and British politicians, to unite these royal families more when Victoria was queen, to have her family marry into the different houses in Europe, to link them together to prevent another onset of wars. But it didn't work. It didn't
Well,
work.
in
World War One
Russia,
broke out anyway.
Russia was always very complicated because you had these German czars, and then you had these other traditional aristocrats in Russia, these Slavic guys, and so.
But the czars weren't entirely German, right?
Well,
I
it
mean,
was
just
mostly the House of Hessen and Schleswig-Holstein and Denmark.
but there was
basically.
look they look at Paul was Russian. Paul the First, who was the father of Alexander, was it Paul the First or second? Was the father of Alexander and Nicholas. So I mean, he wasn't German.
Well, sometimes the rules were sort of broken in Russia when somebody wasn't really the father of someone. But overall, I mean, I did look at all the czars starting from Ivan the Terrible, and it's pretty much. It was pretty much a race. It was a battle for the throne, obviously. So you had the traditional Russians who wanted a throne.
When you talk about the Ruriks, they started out as Swedish pirates, supposedly. People will argue about that. But they intermarried with Mongols and Turks, and they intermarried with all these different groups that ended up making up Russia. So there was that family, you couldn't say they were racially one type. And of course, Russia itself is this mix, right? Ethnically.
With the czars, they sort of did what the European relatives did. So this is something that was quite important to houses such as Hessen or Hanover, Saxon-Coburg, or Saxon-Coburg and Gotha. If you look at the British throne, for example. So you had all these Georges, you had these Hanover kings, and then you had Saxon-Coburg and Gotha, and then you had Hessen. So this is what Queen Elizabeth was, and Prince Philip. They were Hessen and Saxon-Coburg and Gotha. So these specific families, they kept marrying among each other for some of them did this for 1,200 years. So I think they know what they're doing and why they're doing this, and their numbers grew to a staggering amount. And when I did look at the different czars, I mean, it does become somewhat of a thing when at some point specific families were dominant with the Tsarist throne. So, for example, you had Peter the Great. I mean, he was I think he had a regular wife from Russia, or it's like a traditional Russian wife. That was Peter the Great, and then he did this long trip abroad. He met with Sophia of Hanover, mother of future King George I of England. And Peter the Great, he married his only son, Alexei, to Charlotte, a princess from Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel, which was tied to, the Hanover family. And so this was kind of an early attempt to make sort of an alliance, or to have a merger of these families. And so he married off his son to this Princess Charlotte, and her sister Antoinette married Duke Ferdinand Albrecht II. And so these people were involved, and these people were involved. These people were involved in the Bavarian Order of the Illuminati and all these sort of groups. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so this was kind of an early attempt. And
I mean, dynastic marriages are so endemic. Is so such a tactic that regimes, that monarchy uses, that even Napoleon married Maria Louisa of Austria. most famously. And of course, did that prevent his father-in-law from invading invading France?
I mean, this has to happen.
1814?
If
No.
if Napoleon tries to marry into a completely different family, this was an attempt.
He actually did it.
Yeah, he did it. He did it. But this,
and he had a son. It's like, and Napoleon said, "How can my father-in-law,
if Napoleon came
France
from
to dispossess his own grandson of his future, kingdom?"
If Napoleon, the comparison is wrong. If Napoleon had been from a 1,000-year-old family, and if his family had intermarried in a very tight circle, and then he marries, and then Napoleon marries inside of that same circle, that would be meaningful. If Napoleon came from nowhere and he marries this 18-year-old princess from Austria, that doesn't mean much, of course not. But if this goes on for 1,000 years, of course, this is a whole different ball game. And so,
of course, what did it mean in 1914? And the Guns of August came along.
Yeah, but I mean, the mighty British Empire must have had a position about what happened in Russia, with the Czars and the chaos and then the communists. I mean, the British, they didn't just stand by and did nothing. They had invested interest what happened in Russia. So they must have gotten involved through intelligence agencies to some degree. They must have had some kind of an idea what should happen to Russia. I mean, it seems like exactly the thing the British would not do. Just stand there, watch crazy communists take over Russia and hope for the best. I don't think this is what the British did. I mean,
well, they tried the Lockhart
really
plot. They tried to overthrow the Bolsheviks in 1918.
Yeah, and what else did they try? So the thing is this: so going from czar to czar, Peter III, Catherine II, Paul I. So, for example, with here with this guy, Peter III. So they always try to marry their kids to the House of Hessen. So they brought in these princesses from Hessen over and over again, one generation after the other, after the other, after the other. And so, for example, when we came to Alexander I, Alexander I actually became a Freemason. He was interested in that whole thing, which was basically created by under King George I. So this was Alexander I, and this was the era of Napoleon, when Napoleon was trying his
who
empire.
Alexander I wanted to make king of France when Napoleon was removed?
Yeah, they had these plans.
He wanted Bernadette to be.
Yeah, and so Alexander, Tsar Alexander and his siblings strengthened their ties to the British throne with their marriages. So, for example, Tsar Alexander married Louise, Princess of Baden, and the mother was Amalie from House of Hessen. Constantine married Juliane, Princess of Sachsen-Coburg-Saalfeld, which is tied to Saxon-Coburg and Gotha, the British throne. So Juliana, whose brother. Hang on a second. Let me just get through this list. So Constantine married Juliana of Saxon-Coburg-Saalfeld, whose brother Leopold became king of Belgium in 1831. Through her sister Victoria, she was an aunt of Britain's Queen Victoria. And then Helene married the Prince of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, and Maria married the Grand Duke of Sachsen-Weimar-Eisenach, and Catherine married George of Oldenburg. That's like the same line as Hanover. Anna married William II, King of the Netherlands, from Orange-Nassau. That's the same family that conquered Britain in the Glorious Revolution, so these guys are not idiots. And Nicholas I, Emperor of Russia and King of Poland, married Charlotte, Princess of Prussia. That's the family of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. And Michael married Charlotte, Princess of Württemberg, from the House of Sachsen-Hildburghausen. So my point is, I've been looking into this, into the aristocracy, and I found it to be much, much larger than I had. Much larger than I had previously known, because most historians, they only focus on a fraction of them. And they never focus on the entire, the bigger family, extended family, and historians never focused on their intelligence structures and capabilities. So if a family has been around for 1,200 years in some cases, 1,200 years, and they constantly expand their power. So this guy becomes king of Belgium. This guy becomes king of Britain. This guy is, king of queen of Denmark. And we develop all these people, and we acquire new people, and they infiltrated Scotland. They marry a Danish princess to King James, and all these things, and they do a blitz invasion of Britain in the Glorious Revolution. I mean, I take these people very, very seriously, and so I don't think that Britain was very hesitant.
The only reason the Glorious Revolution happened is the Stuarts were so irresponsible, and King James II was such an idiot that he wanted to reintroduce Catholicism to Britain by importing Irish armies, and of course you're going to have a revolution when you go and try to do that, and the Stuarts weren't welcome back. They just weren't after that.
Yeah. But of course, I mean, the Stuarts and, the Catholic networks, they try to regain control over Britain. They try to blow up the royal family of Britain and the parliament, with the November thing and
Well, and they continued to fight the House of Orange in Ireland in the Battle of the Boyne, and if I remember my Irish-English history right. And of course, it was Louis XIV and the Jesuits who were, conniving to try to bring the Stuarts back to power. But the Stuarts languished in Paris, and James II and his descendants never made it back.
Yeah, and so I think that based on the history of some of these very old families, I mean, how successful they were, their intelligence capabilities, I don't think they were just standing by when the events in Russia happened, and I don't think they tried only a few operations. I think they tried more than that, and somehow Britain got itself severely compromised. I think some of these aristocrats, they had to make weird deals with the communists, because I think the communists, they acquired secrets from the older Tsarist intelligence. I mean, you mentioned that some of the or the leadership of the Okhrana, they were removed, and I think that when the communists took power, and they gained specific secrets, they could trade certain things with the aristocracy, especially in Britain, so they could make a deal.
So they would have had everything the Tsarist regime had on their...
Exactly. The communists knew what the Tsars knew, and the Tsars have been, specific houses for generations. So I think that's when a very, very dangerous trade took place, when the communists confronted... let's say, for example, the communists confronted the British throne, for example, and the communists could say, we have this intel, we're sitting on evidence, we're sitting on stuff, maybe we even have the Tsar stashed somewhere in a safe house. Let's make a deal, because if Britain actually intervenes in a big way against Russia, against the communists, if Britain intervenes, this could be bad for the communists. So the communists maybe made this trade, and they said, well, let's just be peaceful about this, and let's just, work this out piece by piece. And I think this is how, A, Britain got compromised, and B, there was a sort of a disgusting and very, very dangerous alliance of certain aristocrats with the communists. And
well, let me, we know two things. Lenin's NEP, which people wanted to invest in Russia, and they wanted to believe that that communism had failed in Russia. So Lenin let them believe that. And of course, I got the book here, Lenin's Last Fight, about NEP and Lenin's speeches about how we have to learn to trade, we have to become capitalists, we have to retreat into capitalism. And so this was one thing that made the Bolshevik regime acceptable to the British, acceptable to the French, acceptable to the Germans, not quite the Americans. But Americans did invest, even though we had no relations with them. You had the Rockefellers invest in the Soviet Union. You had
Koch Industries.
Harrimans invest in the Soviet Union, not investing because they were communists, investing because they thought Russia was not going to be communist for much longer because of Operation Trust. It wasn't just that Lenin had gotten this NEP and retreated into capitalism, but you had this intelligence operation, Operation Trust, in which the Russians convinced all the intelligence services of the West that Russia was being taken over by a monarchist. The monarchist alliance of Central Russia had infiltrated, and that even though the whites had lost the civil war, they had won the intelligence war. And this is what everybody believed until 1928-29, when NEP ended and the Russians, one of the heads of the trust, defected to Finland, and under interrogation said it was an operation. We fooled you. We were controlling Operation Trust. The Czech controlled Operation Trust from the beginning. It was a counterintelligence operation.
Yeah,
and that's where you get Stalin then went to farm collectivization, and then the Soviet Union stopped NEP, but they'd gotten the investment. They had gotten the West to invest in them.
But as I said, Operation Trust would have been, it would have been perfect for an Operation Trust if trust was not completely fake. If the communists did have some sort of an arrangement with certain high-powered aristocrats. Because if the communists had the incriminating material against, let's say, Britain, for example, because the communists knew what the Czars knew and all this stuff, if there was a sort of a deal made between the British throne and the communists, if they made some sort of a deal, this would have been a perfect starting point for something like Operation Trust. Because if you have specific people inside of your operation, you can convince literally everybody. I mean, it's not conceivable that a pure communist deception operation would have been so successful. Because, foreign countries were not stupid. They needed some sort of, they needed evidence, they needed proof. But if the communists were using certain aristocrats from very, very old family, this would have made Operation Trust truly work. Because otherwise, why buy into this narrative if you don't have convincing people telling you that this was so? So I believe there was some really dangerous trades being done. You trade shutting up about certain things, sitting on certain bits of information. You trade that for appeasement, or you trade that for Britain putting in a good word for the communists towards other countries in the West. To sell the lie, to sell Operation Trust. I think this is what.
And so you come around to the 1980s with Gorbachev, and they're going to recycle Operation Trust. Only they're going to use Gorbachev in this new Operation Trust, and they're going to use this more spectacular collapse of communism in the Eastern Bloc. They're going to unravel the Warsaw Pact alliance. They're going to unite Germany, and they're really going to, this time, they're going to get massive investment in technology influxes from the West. And of course, the plan was, according to Anatoly Golitsyn and others, the plan was to get the West to stop making nuclear weapons, which, by the way, the U.S., Britain, and France haven't tested a nuclear weapon in France in 96, but us in Britain since 92. So it's been 31 years since we've even tested one. We still don't have any new nuclear weapons. Russia and China are spitting them out like sausages. So it looks to me like the strategy worked.
But who do you think sold the new iteration of Operation Trust so well? because Putin was KGB.
Gorbachev.
Who was Gorbachev? Gorbachev was the little bitch protege of who was it?
Andropov.
Andropov. I mean, everybody knew he was Andropov's guy, and I mean, I don't think that Gorbachev himself and these other guys who were clearly behind him, I don't think they had the marketing power to fully sell this new Operation Trust by themselves. I think if they have international assets to help sell this thing, because
what's really funny is they sold it to Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher.
How would they manage it without specific help from specific, very credible people, or people who seem credible in the West? Otherwise, I don't think they could have sold this, because if I look at all the literature done about the Putin era, the critical literature about the Putin era, how the money was funneled in, the Russian money was funneled into the city of London, and how all this infiltration took place, and then these weird...
Yeah, Russia did go into Britain in a big way.
Yeah, and then these weird chancellors in Germany, after 1991, all these weirdo chancellors, and nobody was ever exposed.
Schroeder, Merkel.
Yeah, and you would expect, especially British intelligence, to expose these traitors over here. Why hasn't that happened? But instead, this lie was sold about the end of communism. This lie was sold so well.
Now, tell me this. This is something I've been curious about, and it's not written about here in the U.S. and in the English language media. What the heck happened to Helmut Kohl? What was this scandal, and how does that plug into it? Was he done in by a conspiracy?
Helmut Kohl. That leaked. That actually leaked a few years ago.
Let's talk about this for a second. How did they get Kohl? Because Kohl had really outwitted Gorbachev.
Yeah, but the problem was Helmut Kohl. If people don't remember him, it's this huge, tall, fat guy, with the, who was really running the Conservative Party over here in Germany.
Of West Germany, who oversaw the negotiations with Gorbachev and the Soviet Union.
Exactly. So he was known as he was known as a tough guy. I mean, he was ruling the party, the Conservative Party, like a king, and he was chancellor for so long. It was ridiculous. And so, in his early career, he got help to rise up in the party. And he had success because of hidden bank accounts and hidden money. There was a whole system of these what they call
belonging to the Christian Democratic Union.
Yeah, it was a conservative network, and this was partially exposed earlier, even.
These are like political slush funds.
Yeah, slush funds. So you had money coming from these corporations. Let's say, for example, the Flick Corporation. Some people remember the old Flick company during the Nazi era. But interestingly enough, John J. McCloy, who was the American responsible for post-war Germany, McCloy gave some of these people their money back, supposedly, and some of these Nazi dynasties then became pretty important again in post-war Germany. And so Flick money was moving to all these different parties, but Helmut Kohl received some of that money, and the money laundering was done for him and for the party. And so the laundering for the party was done in Hessen, of all places, and one of the responsible politicians or people there laundering the money was a prince, Casimir zu Sein-Wittgenstein, by the way. So this was partially exposed over time. But his personal money, Helmut Kohl's personal slush fund, that was handled by I think the younger Flick. I think it was the younger Flick, and one guy from the Brauchitsch family. Some people remember the old Brauchitsch, who was a general in World War II.
Yes, he was commander of Army Group Center and then Army Group
Correct.
South in 1941
Correct.
and
So,
42.
I mean, I kid you not, I kid you not, the people from a Nazi industrial dynasty and, somebody from a Nazi military family, they were handling money for Helmut Kohl. Problem was, one of the
That's
people.
incredible.
Yeah, well, this is post-war Germany. What can I say? I mean, look up any major German corporation. Look up any chemical corporation from Germany, pharma, and look at how this company was doing in the Nazi era. It's very interesting. And so one of the people involved in this money machine was, I think his name was Kante. And he was a traitor who worked for the East German Stasi. And so he was collecting all this intel and he was giving them to the communists. And then the communists, they made a deal. This came out a few years ago. They made some sort of a deal, whereas the communists would shut up, and the Kohl government would then be more friendly towards Eastern Germany, just play nice and have more, loaning money to the communist government and that sort of thing. And so this came out only years later, and it's likely that Mr. Kohl ran crying to the Americans and begged them for help because his German contacts couldn't fix that problem for him. So this was all swept under the rug, and they made some sort of an arrangement.
They couldn't fix which problem explicitly that he would go to the Americans for. The problem that he had given money to East Germany, or
no, it's just that if Helmut Kohl was compromised, if the Stasi had all the intel about his dirty money, Kohl was not. I think he was not able to make the deal by himself with the communists to work this all out. But I think that because Kohl and his whole party, they were so tight with the Americans, because the Americans had created that party. The Christian Democrats, they were created by the Americans after the war. So this is how close Kohl was to the Americans.
Let me give you what I've read in the American version of Gorbachev's negotiations with Kohl. The Americans, the Bush administration, George H.W. Bush, they did not foresee that the Warsaw Pact would go away, that everything would, they were just thinking, well, how wonderful if Germany could be reunited and the Soviet Union's liberalizing. Then they were really afraid to, stick their finger in it too much and mess it up. They wanted to sort of let the process go. And so they gave the German government, well, you take the lead on this. We'll support you, whatever. And the Americans were again and again, in fact, Baker, Secretary of State Baker, famously, told Gorbachev, look, we'll promise not to move NATO, 1 inch east if you allow this process to go forward. And Gorbachev just basically ignored what he said, because Gorbachev wasn't interested in they didn't make any formal guarantee that NATO wasn't going to expand. Gorbachev believed, and this is what a KGB, disgruntled former KGB guy told me, who was involved in this process, that Gorbachev believed that the United Germany, that they had enough control in West Germany and they controlled East Germany, that the United Germany would be completely under their control.
Yeah, that makes sense. Unfortunately,
and what you're saying, if they had this dirt on Kohl, then they had for total control. Now, what this KGB guy told me was, he said the plan was perfect, except that their plan was it was going to take 6-7 years to unify Germany. They didn't want it to happen too fast because there were Soviet armies in East Germany and they had a lot of infrastructure, and they had prepared these networks and they had these businesses and organizations. And he said that this banker was assassinated, I'm not remembering his name, who they controlled, who would make sure the money didn't come flowing from West Germany into East Germany to buy up the things they controlled. But when this banker died, was assassinated, and they thought maybe the British had done it, but they didn't know. The money immediately was released. This is after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but before, and unification happened like in a year, right? It's in October 1990, and it's going to happen sooner rather than later. And suddenly it happens, and you have Soviet armies technically on the territory of a NATO country, and you had mass defections from the Soviet armies in East Germany, where they could step off the base and they could go get a job. They could, if they spoke German or another language, they could go use their technical skills and have their own thing. And that the Soviet army started to disintegrate on German soil. This was unintended consequence of this event. And of course, there was an attempt to assassinate the West German interior minister. If you remember, he was lying near death, and his two deputies defected to Moscow. And there was a guy with a gun that got near Kohl. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit. What was that about?
Yeah, I mean, the one assassination attempt, the guy in the wheelchair.
This is all in the middle of this. You've got these assassination attempts
the guy in the wheelchair.
against the West German leaders. What was going on?
Yeah, I mean,
how do you read that?
Originally it was. I mean, people thought there was going to be two Germanys. Not divided by troops and the Berlin Wall, but some people thought it was going to be two Germanys. And when it became one, basically every opportunity was used to antagonize people and to sabotage things. So you have to imagine, Western Germany is this industrial technological powerhouse. Living standard was insanely high, and then Soviet East Germany, or a former Soviet East Germany, it was in serious trouble. So, for example,
it's still not as nice there.
It was in trouble because the living standard was much lower than in the West, and all these industrial facilities in the East, they could not compete on a global market anymore. So it was the question of, do we sell this off to foreign investors? Do we close it all down? Do we put in money? What do we do? And so with the communist assets, they tried to, I think, antagonize people as much as possible. So, for example, there were instances, and this has been documented by some of the best investigative journalists here. You had these scheming post-communist Russian investors coming into former East Germany, making a bunch of promises to save a bigger, industrial area or facility, right? And they make all these promises, and so government money is being put in, because of these new foreign investors. And then these foreign investors, they take the money that has been put in by the German government, they take the money, they grab all the technological documentation, the patents and everything, and they run. So this happened. Then
where do they run to?
To Russia. They run to Russia, of course.
Okay,
and then,
so basically, this is just a big Russian scam.
Yeah. So the Russians were stealing. So the Russians were stealing money and technology. Then these politicians, with Helmut Kohl and others, they were pumping crazy amounts of money from Western Germany to Eastern Germany. Mm-hmm. Just causing trouble, financial trouble for West Germany, but this money didn't create any, miracles in East Germany. A lot of this money disappeared, was wasted.
Wasn't there 80 billion Deutschmarks?
It was crazy.
Paid to Gorbachev, and it disappeared. And the Russians said, "Well, we don't know where it is. We got it, but we don't know where it went."
It was nuts. So money was taken from West German citizens, then it was wasted in the East, or it disappeared, and then some of these more interesting oil facilities in the East, they were just sold in insider deals. Many people in the East lost their jobs permanently, so everybody was mad. So the Eastern Germans were mad at the Western Germans and vice versa. Everybody hated each other. And this rift was then exploited by Russian propaganda, and it is exploited to this very day by Russian propaganda. And also the money problems, because the east of Germany was not properly developed, and all this money that was taken from the West Germans, that money went nowhere. And so then you had the euro, the new currency. You had, some of these new policies. You had the new Russian pipelines. You had the Green movement. They, for the first time, they were part of the government, the Green Party. They were in the same government with the Social Democrats under Gerhard Schröder, who is so friendly with Putin. It's insane. I mean, forget all the some of the accusations. I mean, if you compare that to the accusations against Trump,
he became chancellor after Kohl was forced out, right?
Yeah, Schröder, he lost a vote of confidence, but he was chancellor. He was just crazy pro-Russia, and the Green Party then. In the 90s, the Green Party then took off more and more, and then of course the climate thing happened with the hockey stick in 1999, and so Germany was just ruined year by year by year under Angela Merkel. All the foreigners that were let in, the industry that was being limited, the new regulations, just destroying jobs, and the most qualified Germans, they just left and went to America. So there's this insane level of destruction, and always the Russian propaganda always blamed America for the problems of Germany.
Sure,
so this is what the left believes. This is what people in the mainstream now believe. This is what the right wing believes. The conspiracy buffs, they all think it's America. And they think Russia is their savior, even though Russia has caused so many problems here. They cause all these problems here, and then they play these groups, these people against each other. The left against the right.
Stalin that asked the West to bomb Dresden, and then the Russian propaganda blames the Americans and British for destroying Dresden, even though they demanded that the Western Air Forces bomb the city.
Yeah, it's completely nuts, and as I said, the most qualified Germans, they leave, they go to America, they go to the United States. I mean, this has happened so much.
Angela Merkel, just to make clear, she's a Christian Democratic Union leader. I mean, was she the longest reigning German chancellor? I mean, she was chancellor of Germany for a long time.
I mean, Kohl did like 16 years. She was more like 25 or something. It was insane.
She was forever. And
by the way, it was Helmut Kohl who promoted her. It was Helmut Kohl who promoted Merkel. And also there was some, because there's these networks behind the Conservative Party. Some of the people in these networks, they have connections to America, of course, but some have sympathies for Russia, and some people from this network behind the Conservative Party, powerful people, they also promoted Angela Merkel for no apparent reason, but they all pushed her until she was leading the party.
And for those who don't know, the thing about East and West Germany is that since the wall didn't go up, I think you pointed this out last time, since the wall didn't go up till 1962, or was it 61?
61.
61.
Yeah.
That was the Berlin crisis that faced Kennedy at the beginning of his administration. You had all these years for the people that didn't want to live under communist East to move to the West, and the people that wanted to live under the communist system could move from the West to the East. And Angela Merkel's father, she was originally from Hamburg, wasn't she? They moved to East Germany because they wanted to be living, her father wanted to live in a communist country.
Yeah, and Merkel's father, he so they were living in this sort of farm compound. So this was removed and secluded from the rest of society. And he was working for the state-controlled church, and he had all these contacts to the Stasi and the KGB, and his job was to bring the church under full control of the communists. So this was the job that he had, and he was.
This was the Lutheran Church. This was the Lutheran Church.
Yeah, we call it the evangelical or the Protestant church there in those territories. And so this was his job, because the communists didn't